1929. Fall asleep to hilarious history. The Broken Ticker and the Valentine Massacre. In the narrative style of Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The St. Valentine's Day Delivery. By 1929, the party of the century had been going on for so long that nobody remembered where the emergency exits were. We had spent 10 years dancing on a glass floor, convinced it was solid diamond. It was a year where the criminal underworld organized its corporate mergers with a Tommy gun, the Catholic Church got its own sovereign zip code, and the entire global financial system vanished down a trapdoor in lower Manhattan, leaving a generation to wonder who turned off the music. If you desire to understand the tenor of our times, you might look at the calendar, but you would be better served looking at the hardware. In Chicago, a town that has always had a boisterous way of settling its social disputes, the atmosphere had grown particularly strained. It was the 14th of February, a day usually reserved for the exchange of lacy paper hearts and the sugary assurances of devotion. But in the north side of that windy city, the local industry magnates were preparing a different sort of Valentine, one delivered not by a postman, but by a collection of gentlemen whose fashion sense ran exclusively to the somber side of formal wear. There is something inherently humorous about the way men in positions of grave authority choose to conduct their business. We have the captains of industry in their marble towers, and we have the captains of the alleyways in their brick garages. And, truthfully, the distance between their moral codes is about as thick as a single sheet of wet newsprint. Both parties are concerned, above all else, with market share. The only difference is that the man on Wall Street will ruin your life with a fountain pen, while the man on Clark Street prefers the more dramatic, albeit noisier, efficiency of a drum magazine Thompson submachine gun. On this particular morning, a group of Mr. Al Capone's most dedicated employees decided to go for a stroll in the crisp winter air. They were dressed in the uniforms of the Chicago Police Department, a garment which, I have often thought, possesses the remarkable property of rendering a man invisible to the moral law, provided he carries a badge and a look of practiced indifference. They marched into a garage, a drafty structure that served as the headquarters for Mr. Bugs Moran's rival enterprise. Now, one must admire the theatricality of the criminal mind. It takes a certain amount of audacity to dress up as the law to break the law, but that is the very spirit of 1929. We were a nation of pretenders, convinced that if we wore the right clothes and held our mouths in the correct fashion, we could pass for anything. The men in the garage, being simple, hard-working bootleggers, saw the uniforms and assumed they were about to be treated to one of those tedious, bureaucratic shakedowns that are the necessary cost of doing business in a city that prides itself on being crooked. They lined themselves up against the wall as if they were pupils waiting for a particularly stern schoolmaster to inspect their fingernails. They did not suspect that this was not a routine audit. They did not realize that the policemen standing before them were not interested in bribes or documentation, but were, in fact, conducting a definitive corporate restructuring. In the jazz age, a hostile takeover does not involve complex financial instruments or voting by proxy. It involves the rhythmic, percussive application of lead. When the gentlemen in the uniforms finally opened fire, it was with the terrifying mechanical precision of a sewing machine operated by a madman. It was a symphony of industrial efficiency. In the span of a few heartbeats, the North Side Gang's long-term business prospects were liquidated with a finality that would have made a bankruptcy judge weep with envy. When the smoke cleared, and it always clears, though it usually leaves a terrible stench behind, the policemen marched out, once again, putting on the charade of public servants, leaving behind a scene that looked, to the untrained eye, like a poorly managed slaughterhouse. But to the astute observer of the American landscape, it looked like progress. It was a brutal reminder that in a world where everyone is scrambling for the last chair when the music stops, the man with the loudest instrument often gets to write the rules. The press, of course, had a field day. They splashed the gore across the front pages with a glee that suggested they were quite bored with the usual fare of society weddings and flagpole sitting. They called it a massacre, which is a word that sounds very impressive and carries a great deal of gravity, though it is merely a dramatic way of describing what happens when two versions of the truth collide in a narrow space. One cannot help but muse upon the irony of it all. Here we were, a nation of supposed civilized progress, tinkering with radios and automobiles, yet we were still settling our grievances with the same caveman logic that prevailed when man first discovered that a rock could be used for something other than cracking nuts. We had all the modern conveniences of the 20th century, yet we were living with the ethics of the 14th. As I watched the dust settle on that Chicago garage, I felt a familiar shiver of recognition. It was the feeling that the party, while still loud and bright, had taken a turn toward the sinister. We were all running on a treadmill of our own invention, moving faster and faster toward a horizon that was retreating just as quickly. The Tommy gun had spoken, the ledger had been wiped clean, and the rest of the country was simply waiting for the next delivery. And if you think the rest of the world was shocked, you are mistaken. We were merely waiting to see who would be the next one to step in front of the drum magazine, hoping all the while that it would be someone else. It is a terrible thing to realize that we are all in one way or another just waiting for our own particular brand of delivery to arrive, whether it comes in a crate of champagne, or a hail of lead. Chapter 2. The 15-minute Oscars. If there is one thing the human race excels at, surpassing even our remarkable capacity for inventing ways to complicate simple tasks, it is the art of self-congratulation. We are, by nature, a species that enjoys nothing quite so much as hearing our own names read aloud in a room full of people who are pretending that our minor achievements are actually earth-shattering triumphs. It is a harmless enough vanity, I suppose, a bit like dressing a dog in a tuxedo and expecting him to bark with more refinement. By the spring of 1929, the American motion picture industry had decided that it was high time for it to stop merely inventing fantasies for the masses and start acknowledging its own divinity. It was not enough to dominate the collective consciousness of the public. The industry required a physical totem, a golden icon, to sit upon the mantelpiece of every director, actor, and technician who had managed to avoid being fired for at least 2 consecutive productions. And so, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was born, a name so grand and academic that it almost succeeded in hiding the fact that the entire enterprise was largely a marketing ploy, designed to keep the ticket buyers hooked on the dream. The inaugural presentation of these trophies took place at a private banquet in Hollywood. It was, by all accounts, a quiet, orderly, and decidedly uncinematic affair. There were no flashing bulbs, no screaming crowds, no dramatic pauses while a starlet wept over a statuette, and certainly no suspense to speak of. In fact, the winners had been announced 3 months prior. Imagine the excitement of a horse race, where the judges hand out the ribbons before the horses have even been fed their oats. It was a beautiful monument to corporate self-congratulation, completed and filed away in the archives of history before the roast chicken even had the decency to get cold on the plates. I have attended my fair share of banquets in my time, and I can tell you that the secret to a successful gala is the presence of an open bar and the distinct absence of anyone who feels obligated to give a speech longer than a heartbeat. The Hollywood elite, however, have never been known for their restraint. They looked at a room full of their peers and saw not a gathering of colleagues, but a captive audience for their own personal dramas. They had created an award for themselves, for their own work, judged by their own friends. It was a closed loop of vanity, a snake eating its own tail, and it was glorious in its audacity. Consider the spectacle, a collection of men and women who lived their lives by projection, who understood the power of shadow and light, sitting down to eat, drink, and wait for their names to be called to receive a piece of gold-plated tin. There were no cameras to capture the moment for posterity. The public, who paid their nickels and dimes to worship these idols on the silver screen, were not invited. This was a private matter, a ritual of succession, a way for the titans of the studio lots to ensure that everyone understood exactly who held the reins of the dream factory. It is truly a marvelous thing, the way we insist on building cathedrals to our own importance. We do it in politics, we do it in commerce, and we do it in the arts. We convince ourselves that if we simply organize our mutual admiration into a formal structure, with committees and bylaws and polished little statues, then our fleeting, fragile efforts at creativity might suddenly possess the permanence of the pyramids. We want to believe that we are building something that will last 1,000 years, when in reality we are just decorating the lobby of a hotel that is already being remodeled for the next tenant. One cannot help but admire the honesty of the process, though. In a world where every action is clouded by a dozen competing motives, there is a refreshing purity to the Academy's initial effort. They didn't bother with the messy pretense of a competition. They didn't ask the public to vote or bother with the tedious necessity of impartial panels. They simply looked around the room, decided who was the most important person at the table, and handed them a prize. It is the purest expression of the Hollywood mindset. Success is not something you earn through the slow, agonizing process of quality. It is something you manifest by simply sitting in the right chair and waiting for the applause. The menu that night was, I am told, quite standard for the era. There was talk of artistic excellence, which is a convenient phrase that covers a multitude of sins, and technical achievement, which is a fancy way of saying someone managed to keep the camera in focus for 10 minutes at a time. Through the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation, one could hear the distinct sound of egos expanding to fill the void. It was a gala of the self-assured, a masquerade ball where everyone was wearing their own face and claiming it was a work of genius. I have often thought that if the rest of us could be so bold, the world would be a much more interesting place. Imagine if the local cobbler held a banquet to award himself a trophy for the most comfortable heel in the county, and invited all his friends to drink his wine and agree with him. Imagine if a politician, upon finishing a term of office, simply printed his own certificate of excellence and demanded that the tax office frame it. It is, frankly, the only way to ensure that one's reputation remains untarnished by the cruel, indifferent judgment of the public. By controlling the award, you control the narrative. By controlling the narrative, you control the history. And since history is, as the saying goes, just a set of lies agreed upon, why not be the one who writes the script? As the night wore on and the coffee grew lukewarm, the participants in this grand charade surely felt the glow of satisfaction that comes from knowing the game is rigged in one's own favor. They had created a tradition in a single evening, a ritual that would eventually grow to consume the entire world's attention. They didn't know it then, of course. They were just a few hundred people in a room, busy congratulating each other on their cleverness, unaware that they were laying the foundation for a global religion of celebrity. It is all quite funny when you step back and look at it through the lens of time. We spend so much energy worrying about whether we are being seen, whether we are being appreciated, whether we have left a mark that won't be washed away by the next tide. And yet, here were these pioneers of the cinema, creating a system that guaranteed they would be remembered, at least for as long as the gold plating held out. The Academy Awards, as we know them, would eventually become a circus of gargantuan proportions, a multi-million-dollar industry unto itself. But that night, in a quiet Hollywood banquet hall, it was just a group of people having dinner. They were human beings, driven by the same anxieties, the same vanities, and the same desperate need for validation that drives the rest of us. The only difference is that they had the audacity to write their own review. And so, the first chapter of the industry's official biography was written in the language of roast chicken and self-congratulation. It was a masterpiece of corporate efficiency, a perfect little bubble of triumph in a year that would soon see the walls of every bank in the country come crashing down. They got their prizes, they toasted their own brilliance, and they went home to bed, blissfully unaware that the world was about to change in ways that no amount of gold plating could ever fix. It is the human condition, after all. We like to celebrate while the floor is being pulled out from under us, just to see if we can land on our feet with a grin. Chapter 3. The Lateran Treaty. The Pope's New Landlord. There is nothing quite so entertaining as a dispute over property, especially when the disputants are two men who both believe they have a direct line to the Almighty. It brings a certain zest to the legal proceedings that you simply cannot find in a probate court or a suburban zoning hearing. For 60 long years, the Vatican and the Italian state had been engaged in a diplomatic Cold War that was as persistent as a case of the hiccups and twice as annoying to the neighbors. The Pope, the prisoner of the Vatican, as he liked to style himself, had been sulking behind his high walls, refusing to recognize the unified Kingdom of Italy, while the Italians, in turn, were busy trying to run a modern nation without the blessing of the Almighty's local representative. It was a stalemate of grand proportions, a historical Mexican standoff that had begun when Rome was folded into the Italian state in 1870. Enter Benito Mussolini, a man whose ambition was matched only by the size of his jaw and his remarkable ability to believe his own press clippings. Mussolini understood that a dictator is only as strong as his public relations strategy, and having the Catholic Church as a perpetual thorn in his side was not conducive to the image of a calm, orderly, and divinely sanctioned regime. He needed the Church's imprimatur, and the Church needed to stop pretending it was in the middle of a medieval siege. And so the two titans of Rome decided to settle their property dispute in the most civilized manner possible. They sat down, drew a line on a map, and invented a new country. This was the genesis of the Lateran Treaty. It is a masterpiece of political pragmatism that proves that even the most sacred of dogmas can be negotiated if you throw in a sovereign post office, a tax exemption, and a little bit of breathing room. The deal was quite simple, really. Mussolini agreed that the Vatican would be a sovereign, independent state, a tiny 100-acre pocket of holy ground tucked into the heart of Rome. The Pope would be the king of this little kingdom with all the trimmings, his own currency, his own postage stamps, his own railway station, and the absolute right to be as stubborn as he pleased behind his own gates. In exchange, the Pope agreed to finally recognize the existence of the Kingdom of Italy, and, by extension, the legitimacy of Signor Mussolini's government. It is, when one considers it, the ultimate real estate deal. History is full of emperors and kings who have tried to conquer the papacy with swords, cannons, and sheer brute force, only to find that the Church is notoriously difficult to dislodge. Mussolini, however, did it with a pen and a bit of administrative red tape. He didn't conquer the Vatican. He shrank it until it was small enough to be manageable, and then he declared it a victory for everyone involved. It is the sort of logic that appeals to the businessman in all of us. If you cannot own the store, buy the land it sits on. Give the proprietor a nice, shiny title, and make sure he agrees to stop complaining about your business practices. The ceremony of the signing was a marvel of the modern age. There was all the solemnity of a religious ritual mixed with the crisp, efficient air of a corporate board meeting. Mussolini, sporting his best suit and his most serious expression, looked like a man who was very pleased to have finally cleared his desk of a 60-year-old file. The representatives of the Vatican, draped in their traditional robes, seemed equally relieved to have secured their sovereignty without having to undergo the indignity of actually fighting for it. They had traded their claim to the rest of Italy for a secure tax-free sanctuary in Rome, a deal that any shrewd accountant would call a masterstroke of defensive asset management. But consider the absurdity of it all. We have an international border running through a city where a man can buy a gelato on one side of the street and be in a foreign nation by the time he finishes the second scoop. A man can mail a letter from the Vatican and send it to the other side of the planet, entirely independent of the Italian mail service. It is a sovereign entity that produces more holy water than wheat, and whose military defense consists almost entirely of men in brightly colored pantaloons who carry halberds that were cutting-edge technology in the 15th century. It is a political pocket watch, a miniature kingdom of the mind and the spirit, operating in the middle of a modern industrial state, all thanks to the stroke of a pen in 1929. The people of Rome, I suspect, found the whole affair as amusing as I do. They had spent decades watching the drama from the sidelines, and now they were suddenly expected to bow to a new set of rules that had been invented in a private office. They saw the priests walking with a new spring in their step, and the fascists looking a bit more pious than usual, and they knew that the world had shifted. It hadn't shifted because of a great spiritual awakening, but because the politicians had realized that it is much easier to govern a people when you have the local authorities in your pocket, or in this case, in their own little gated community. There is a lesson here, I suppose, for the cynical reader. If you ever find yourself locked in a dispute with a power that claims to be universal, do not reach for your weapon. Reach for a surveyor's map and a legal contract. If you give them enough land to feel important and enough autonomy to feel independent, you can buy their silence for a generation. It is the divine right of kings, rewritten for the age of bureaucracy and municipal planning. Mussolini was not the first man to try to negotiate with heaven, but he was perhaps the first to realize that heaven's price could be settled with a decent zoning ordinance. As I look back on that year, with the stock market preparing to commit ritual suicide and the mobsters busy painting Chicago red, this treaty stands out as a curious little oasis of order. While everyone else was busy trying to blow up their competition or bankrupt their neighbors, these two sides, the state and the church, decided to shake hands and build a fence. It was a cynical act, yes, but it was also a strangely peaceful one. It provided a permanent home for an ancient institution, and it provided a temporary sheen of legitimacy to a regime that was, to put it mildly, skating on thin ice. It is a wonder that the world did not collapse from the sheer weight of such irony. We have the Pope in his private city, the dictator in his public office, and the entire population of Italy squeezed in between, trying to navigate their lives through a landscape of changing borders and shifting loyalties. It was the perfect setup for the decade that was to come, a world where the lines on the map were getting more rigid, even as the stability of the entire enterprise was beginning to fray at the edges. But for that moment, in 1929, the Vatican was secure, Mussolini was happy, and the lawyers were finished with their paperwork. It is a rare day in history when the politicians actually get what they want without having to burn the house down to get it. And for that small mercy, I suppose we should all be grateful. It just goes to show that in this world, if you hold out long enough, you can eventually negotiate a sovereign zip code, provided you are willing to make the right friends and look the other way when the check is cashed. Chapter 4. Leon Trotsky's Permanent Eviction. If there is a universal law governing the affairs of men, it is that a house, no matter how grand its architecture, simply cannot accommodate two inhabitants who both insist on being the master of the foyer. The Soviet Union, in the year of our Lord 1929, found itself in the grip of a particularly ferocious architectural renovation. Joseph Stalin, a man who possessed the personality of a blunt instrument and the organizational skills of a master jailer, had decided that the Russian experiment was not quite spacious enough for his own burgeoning ego, and the prickly, intellect-heavy presence of Leon Trotsky. Now Trotsky was a man of the revolution, a theorist who could spin a speech as long as a Volga winter and twice as cold. He was the sort of fellow who believed that ideas were the most dangerous weapons in the arsenal, which is a charming sentiment, until you find yourself staring down a man who believes that a firing squad is a more practical tool for discourse. Stalin, on the other hand, was not a man of grand theories. He was a man of the ledger, the committee, and the midnight knock on the door. He understood that while an idea might move a mountain, It is the man who controls the shovels who decides where the debris goes. The struggle between these two is the definitive lesson in what we might call totalitarian office politics. It is a game that makes the petty bickering of a local school board look like a picnic at the vicarage. In a normal workplace, when you lose an argument with the boss, you might be asked to clear out your desk, take your potted plant, and find a position at a firm that appreciates your particular brand of incompetence. In the Soviet Union, however, if you lose the argument, you do not simply lose your job. You lose your right to exist in the collective memory. You lose your background. Stalin began the process of editing Trotsky out of existence with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who knows he has all the time in the world. First, he was removed from the committees. Then he was removed from the party. Then he was removed from the cities. Finally, in early 1929, the order was given that he was to be packed onto a ship bound for Turkey, effectively exiling the man who had helped build the very machine that was now grinding him into dust. One must admire the sheer surgical precision of the erasure. Stalin did not just banish the man, he rewrote the photographs. If you looked at a picture of the revolution from a few years prior, you would see Trotsky standing right there, bold as brass, next to Lenin. A few months later, you would look at that same photograph and, presto, Trotsky had vanished. He was airbrushed away, replaced by a convenient smudge of ink, or a strategically placed comrade who hadn't been anywhere near the original event. It is a terrifying thought, is it not, that a man's life, his history, and his contributions can be treated like a typo in a manuscript, deleted with a stroke of a pen to make the page look cleaner. Trotsky, for his part, went to his exile with the grim determination of a martyr who knows he is being cast in a play he didn't write. He spent his time in Turkey, writing long, impassioned tracts about why Stalin was a betrayer of the cause, which is a bit like a man on a sinking ship complaining that the captain is steering the vessel into a reef instead of a pier. He was shouting into the wind, oblivious to the fact that the gale had already blown the windows out of the building back in Moscow. It is the tragedy of the ideologue. They believe that the truth is a self-evident thing that will eventually rise to the surface like a cork in a bathtub. But history, I have observed, is rarely so tidy. History is a puddle of ink, and the man with the biggest brush is the one who decides what the picture looks like. Stalin knew that if he could convince the people that Trotsky had never been a hero, then for all practical purposes, he never had been. Imagine the irony of it. The Bolsheviks had set out to create a society where the worker was king, where the old structures of class and privilege were burned to the ground. And yet, within a decade, they had replaced the Tsar with a man who exercised power with a level of whim that would have made Ivan the Terrible look like a benevolent schoolmaster. The revolution had eaten its children, and the ones that remained were busy picking their teeth and denying they'd ever had an appetite. I often think of Trotsky on that ship, watching the coastline of his homeland fade into the gray mist of the Black Sea. He was a man of the world, a brilliant, arrogant, and undoubtedly dangerous man, reduced to a ghost in his own time. He was a prisoner of his own success, having helped create a system that was perfectly designed to destroy him. It is a cautionary tale for any of us who think we can tame the machinery of power. You can tinker with the gears, you can oil the pistons, and you can believe that you are the one pulling the lever, but the machine has a logic of its own. It does not care about your theories or your pamphlets. It only cares about its own preservation, and it will discard anyone who suggests it might be heading the wrong way. Stalin's triumph was total, and it was entirely hollow. He had secured the top of the mountain, but he had done so by clearing everyone else off the peak. He stood there alone, surrounded by the silence of the people who were too afraid to whisper, and he called it stability. It is the kind of peace that one finds in a graveyard, neatly ordered, perfectly quiet, and utterly devoid of life. The Russian people watched this drama unfold with the weary resignation of a horse that has been whipped so many times it has stopped flinching. They had been promised a new world, and they were getting a new set of masters. The portraits changed, the names of the streets were updated, and the history books were reprinted with a new set of heroes. But the bread lines remained, and the winter remained, and the cold, unyielding hand of the state remained. It is a funny thing about power. It always promises to move the earth, yet it always ends up exactly where it started, in the hands of a few men sitting in rooms, deciding who gets to stay and who gets to go. Trotsky was just the most prominent passenger in a long line of folks who were shown the door, and as for Stalin, he would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, knowing that he had set a precedent. If you can erase a man as famous as Trotsky, how long before someone comes along with a bigger brush and a longer arm and decides that it is your turn to be erased from the picture? In the end, this episode serves as a reminder that we are all, to some degree, writing our own history. We define ourselves by our actions, our words, and the company we keep. But if we rely too heavily on the favor of the powerful, we might find that our history is not our own. It can be edited, redacted, and archived into oblivion. Stalin wanted to build a legacy that was eternal, and in doing so, he showed the world just how temporary, how fragile, and how incredibly silly the business of human governance really is. We are all just actors in a farce, and the stagehand in the wings is always waiting for his chance to kill the lights. Chapter 5. Herbert Hoover's Great Expectation. There is a peculiar kind of optimism that settles upon a man when he finds himself suddenly elevated to the highest office in the land. It is a heady, intoxicating substance, much like the first glass of champagne at a wedding. It masks the taste of the cheap gin that has been served all night, and makes the bride look a good deal more radiant than she might appear in the cold, unforgiving light of dawn. In March of 1929, Herbert Hoover took the oath of office, a man of significant engineering pedigree and a reputation for organizational efficiency that would have made a Swiss watchmaker weep with admiration. He stood before the American people and declared, with the unwavering confidence of a man who has never been wrong about a spreadsheet in his life, that the nation was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. It was a statement of such magnificent crystalline confidence that one cannot help but admire the sheer audacity of the delivery. It was a masterpiece of political timing, a bold proclamation pinned to the masthead of the ship just as the winds began to shift toward a hurricane that would soon turn the Pacific into a duck pond. Mr. Hoover, you see, was a man who believed in the inevitability of progress. He looked at the smoking chimneys of the factories, the teeming exchanges of Wall Street, and the general clamor of an America that was busy inventing, buying, and selling its way to the moon, and he concluded that the machinery of prosperity had finally been perfected. He thought he had found the lever that would raise the standard of living for every man, woman, and child, and he intended to pull it with a steady administrative hand. Poor Mr. Hoover. He was an engineer by trade, and he approached the business of governing a nation as if he were designing a bridge across a treacherous river. He had all the blueprints. He had calculated the stresses and the strains, and he had ensured that the rivets were of the finest quality. What he failed to account for was that the river was not merely flowing. It was a chaotic, sentient, and occasionally temperamental beast that had no intention of staying within the banks he had so carefully surveyed. He believed in the efficacy of the system, never suspecting that the system itself was built upon a foundation of sand, leverage, and the frantic collective delusion of a million speculators who thought they were playing a game of skill when, in fact, they were merely betting on the spin of a wheel in a casino that had already been declared bankrupt by the House. He was a man of the great expectation. He saw a horizon clear of clouds, despite the fact that the atmosphere was already thick with the static of an impending electrical discharge. His inaugural address was a document of profound faith in the American spirit, an ode to the idea that if we all just worked a little harder, bought a little more, and kept our eyes fixed on the ledger, we would eventually reach a state of grace where the concept of poverty was merely a dusty term to be found in the encyclopedias of our ancestors. It was a charming sentiment. It is, perhaps, the most American sentiment of all. The belief that the future is just an upgraded version of the present, only with faster cars, more efficient telephones, and a surplus of everything we could possibly desire. One imagines Mr. Hoover sitting in the Oval Office, his desk organized with the rigid precision of a military encampment, looking out at the city of Washington and believing that he was the captain of a steady ship. He did not know that the iceberg was already looming in the fog, its jagged peak just waiting to scrape the bottom of the treasury. He was the most qualified man in the country, the great engineer who had fed nations in the wake of the Great War, and he had come to the presidency at the very moment when the nation was ready to transform from a bustling workshop into a house of cards. The irony is so thick that one could carve it into statues and sell it to tourists. The public, for its part, ate it up with a spoon. They were hungry for the promise of eternal growth. They wanted to believe that the music would never stop, that the ticker tape would never run out of ink, and that their bank accounts would continue to swell like dough in a warm oven. They looked at Mr. Hoover and saw the face of certainty. They didn't want to hear about the dangers of excessive credit or the fragility of the international market. They wanted to hear that they were on the verge of a triumph. And so they cheered. They bought cars they couldn't afford. They traded stocks on margins that defied the laws of gravity. And they lived as if tomorrow were a rumor that had been permanently debunked by the reality of today. It is a curious thing how we allow our leaders to become the mirrors of our own vanity. We ask them to tell us that we are brilliant, that we are invincible, and that our current state of existence is the pinnacle of human achievement. We do not want them to tell us that we are fragile, that we are vulnerable to the whims of the market, or that the prosperity we enjoy is built on a foundation of precarious promises. Mr. Hoover gave us exactly what we wanted, and we rewarded him with our collective unwavering attention. It was a transaction of the highest order, a trade of truth for comfort, and it was performed with the solemnity of a religious ritual. As the summer of 1929 bloomed, a year that would soon be defined by the frantic, desperate scramble of a nation trying to catch a falling star, Mr. Hoover continued to speak of the final triumph. The phrases were polished, the rhetoric was soaring, and the confidence was absolute. It is the sort of thing that makes one smile even now with the benefit of a century's worth of hindsight. We can see the trapdoor, we can see the frayed rope, and we can see the gentleman standing on the stage taking a bow for a performance that is about to end in a most spectacular disaster. There is a lesson here, perhaps, about the limitations of expertise. You can be the greatest engineer in the world. You can have a heart of gold and a mind of iron. And you can believe with every fiber of your being that you have everything under control. But the world is a disorderly, messy, and fundamentally ungovernable place. It does not respond to blueprints, it does not respect the hierarchy of the office, and it certainly does not care about the promises of a politician. It goes its own way, drifting through the dark, indifferent to the expectations of the men who think they are at the helm. By the time the autumn leaves began to turn and the first shivers of the coming winter began to rattle the window panes of the exchange, the great expectation had begun to sour. The poverty that Mr. Hoover had declared to be in its final hours was, in fact, merely changing its clothes and preparing to enter the national parlor as a permanent, unwelcome guest. The triumph was delayed and the celebration was canceled, but the speech, that magnificent, doomed, and perfectly timed speech, would remain, a testament to the fact that sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a lie is an absolute, unshakable conviction in something that simply isn't true. It was, all in all, a charming, tragic, and profoundly human moment. We are all like Mr. Hoover at one time or another, standing on our own little podiums, declaring our own little triumphs, and failing to notice that the tide is already halfway up the stairs. It is the folly of the species, I suppose, and it is the very thing that makes our history so remarkably and so painfully entertaining. We march forward with our flags waving, convinced that we are heading toward the light, right up until the moment we step off the edge of the world. Chapter 6. The Geneva Convention Upgrade. If there is a pursuit more quintessentially human than the art of going to war, I have yet to encounter it. We are, by all accounts, a pugnacious bunch, possessed of a restless spirit that finds its highest expression in the systematic destruction of our neighbor's fence, barn, and political autonomy. Yet, having established that we cannot resist the urge to draw swords, or more accurately, to manufacture cannons, gases, and high-explosive contraptions of increasing complexity, we are simultaneously seized by a bizarre, twitchy, and altogether charming impulse. The desire to draft a list of rules for how to behave while we are busy murdering one another. It is a contradiction of the highest order, a comedy of manners performed in the middle of a slaughterhouse. We spent the better part of 1929 gathering in the pleasant, clean-air city of Geneva, a place that seems entirely too polite to house the diplomatic representatives of nations who, only a decade prior, had spent 4 years turning the European continent into a muddy, cratered wasteland. The nations of the world had decided, with all the gravity of a group of schoolboys debating the rules of a game of marbles, that it was high time to rewrite the code for the treatment of prisoners of war. One cannot help but marvel at the premise. We are, in effect, designing civilized boundaries for human cruelty. We are sitting in comfortable chairs, sipping herbal tea, and debating whether it is acceptable to feed a captive soldier a diet of dry crackers, or whether he is entitled to a slightly more robust caloric intake, all under the charming wide-eyed assumption that the next time we decide to disassemble civilization, we will pause to consult the rulebook and remember our manners. It is an exercise in optimism that borders on the hallucinatory. We are creating a fine lace-edged handkerchief to cover the jagged, weeping wound of organized slaughter. The delegates were a collection of the world's finest minds, men who had spent their entire careers practicing the delicate art of saying "I agree," while secretly sharpening their knives behind their backs. They drafted clauses about the humane treatment of detainees, the sanctity of medical tents, and the appropriate way to process a surrender. They spoke in the hushed, reverent tones of theologians discussing the finer points of original sin, ignoring the fact that the tools they were sharpening back home, the chemical weapons, the aerial bombers, the long-range artillery, were designed specifically to render such rules not only obsolete, but physically impossible to uphold. It is the great vanity of our age that we think we can legislate away the inherent ugliness of our darker impulses. We believe that if we just add a few more articles to the treaty, if we refine the language until it sounds sufficiently high-minded, we might somehow civilize the uncivilizable. It is as if a man were to spend his days painting a lovely floral mural on the walls of a room that he knows is currently being filled with dynamite. He wants to believe that the art will mitigate the explosion, or perhaps that the force of the blast will be tempered by the sheer, overwhelming beauty of the decor. Consider the absurdity of a prisoner of war camp. You have taken a man, perhaps a baker or a clerk, who was snatched from his life and handed a rifle, and you have locked him in a pen. Now, the delegates in Geneva are debating whether this man is entitled to write letters home, whether he should be provided with decent bedding, and whether he must be allowed to practice his religion. It is, undoubtedly, a noble sentiment. It is the sort of thing that gives one hope for the future of the species. And yet, it is played out against a backdrop of nationalistic fervor that demands that one's enemy be treated as less than human. The contradiction is so profound that one could laugh until one's ribs ache, were it not for the fact that the joke is written in the blood of the men who will eventually inhabit these camps. There was a great deal of talk about the sanctity of the individual and the dignity of the combatant. I listened to these speeches, metaphorically speaking, and I was struck by the sheer, unadulterated performance of it all. It is a pantomime. We know, as surely as we know that the sun will set, that when the shooting starts again, the first thing to be thrown out of the trench is the rule book. We have a way of convincing ourselves that the next war will be different, that it will be a gentleman's war, fought with strict adherence to the protocols established in the luxury hotels of Switzerland. It is the same mistake we made before the last one, and it is the same mistake we will make before the next. We are a forgetful species, or perhaps we are merely a species that enjoys the comfort of a lie. The diplomats, however, were not to be discouraged. They produced document after document, filled with words like protection, dignity, and humanitarianism. They smiled for the cameras, shook hands with the fervor of long-lost brothers, and returned to their respective capitals, feeling as though they had done a great day's work. They had satisfied their consciences. They had checked the box marked civilization. They had convinced themselves that they had built a firewall against the apocalypse, all the while knowing that the very nations they represented were busy hoarding mustard gas and building bigger, faster, and more efficient ways to kill one another. It is a fascinating, whimsical, and deeply depressing spectacle. We are like children playing at hospital while the house is burning down around us. We are so obsessed with the details of the bandages that we have forgotten to look at the flames. But perhaps that is for the best. If we truly looked at the flames, if we truly recognized the reality of what we were preparing for, we might find it impossible to go on with the charade. And so, we focus on the bandages, we focus on the letters, we focus on the dignity of the prisoner, and we hold on to these things as if they were talismans that could ward off the evil eye. I suppose there is a certain dignity in the act of trying to contain the chaos, even if it is a failure, even if it is a farce, even if the rules are destined to be shredded the moment the first shell lands. There is something human about the attempt. We want to believe that we are better than the beasts. We want to believe that we are capable of restraint, even when we are engaged in the most unrestrained activity imaginable. It is this stubborn, illogical, and beautiful insistence on our own goodness that defines us, perhaps more than the wars themselves. So, the nations of the world met in Geneva and wrote their rules. They argued about the thickness of the blankets and the rights of the captured, and they went home to sleep soundly, comforted by the ink on the parchment. It was a year of treaties, a year of handshakes, and a year of absolute blinding hubris. We were busy designing the boundaries of our own cruelty, convinced that we were creating a masterpiece of international law, when in fact we were just drafting the terms of our own eventual failure. And yet we did it with such elegance, such charm, and such profound sincerity that one almost forgets to mention that the ink was barely dry before we were back to the business of designing the very machines that would make these rules seem like the quaint, forgotten scribblings of a more innocent age. It is the human condition in a nutshell. We are experts at polishing the silver while the ship is sinking beneath our feet, and we do it with such grace that we almost convince ourselves it is the most important task in the world. Chapter 7. The Graf Zeppelin's Global Lap. There are some men, and a fair share of women, who suffer from the peculiar persistent delusion that the earth is too small and too stationary. They look at the horizon and see not a boundary, but an invitation to be elsewhere, preferably in a manner that defies the common-sense laws of locomotion. In the year of our Lord 1929, this restlessness found its most magnificent expression in a floating, silver-skinned cigar known as the Graf Zeppelin. It was a German airship, a behemoth of duralumin and gas-filled ambition, which decided to treat the entire globe as if it were a local track and field event. The Graf was, by all accounts, a floating hotel of the highest order. It carried millionaires who had grown bored with their yachts, journalists who had grown tired of writing about the same old bank robberies, and a grand piano because nothing says, "I am conquering the elements," quite like the ability to play a sonata at 3,000 feet above the Pacific. It was the absolute peak of lighter-than-air luxury, a concept that is inherently humorous when you pause to consider the physics involved. We have spent thousands of years trying to keep our feet planted firmly on the ground, and then, at the first opportunity, we decide that the proper place for a sophisticated evening of music and fine dining is suspended by a bladder of flammable gas in the middle of a thunderstorm. The ship set out on a global lap, a journey of some 21 days, intended to prove that the future of travel belonged not to the dirty, clattering trains or the cramped, vibrating ships, but to the clouds. It was a noble vision. It was a vision of a world where one could sip a sherry over the Siberian tundra and wake up in Tokyo without ever having to brush against the grime of the common man. It was the ultimate expression of the 20th century desire to rise above the mud and the toil, to inhabit a realm of pure, streamlined comfort. One imagines the passengers lounging in the wicker furniture, peering out of the portholes at the tiny, inconsequential details of the world far below. They saw the mountains as mere wrinkles in a carpet, the rivers as shimmering threads, and the cities as clusters of pebbles. It must have given them a godlike sense of detachment. When you are floating in a silver cigar, you're removed from the petty squabbles of the streets, the debates of the parliaments, and the nervous ticks of the stock market. You are, for a few glorious weeks, a creature of the air. It is a lovely way to live, provided you don't think too hard about the fact that your entire existence is predicated on the integrity of a few rubberized fabric bags and the temperament of the local atmospheric pressure. The airship was a marvel of the modern age, a testament to the fact that with enough engineering, enough helium, and enough sheer, stubborn Germanic pride, one can convince the public that travel by dirigible is the next logical step in human evolution. And for a while, it seemed as though they were right. Everyone who was anyone wanted to be on a Zeppelin. It was the stylish way to be terrified. It was the fashionable way to flirt with gravity. It was the only way to demonstrate that you were truly a person of the future, someone who had transcended the pedestrian limitations of the internal combustion engine and the iron rail. I cannot help but find the whole endeavor deeply and profoundly comical. We have a history of trying to master the heavens, starting with Icarus and his waxen wings. And yet, here we were, thousands of years later, doing essentially the same thing, only with more gin and a better sense of interior design. We were still at the mercy of the wind, the rain, and the fickle nature of the vacuum. We were still, in essence, trying to hitch a ride on the back of the atmosphere, pretending that we had conquered the skies when we were really just drifting wherever the air currents decided we should go. The Graf made its way around the world, a silver streak in the blue, a fleeting, shimmering promise of a new era. People on the ground would stop their work, look up, and point, their mouths hanging open in a mixture of wonder and mild alarm. It was a spectacle, a piece of theater played out on the stage of the sky. It was a reminder that for all our technological grandstanding, we are still a species that loves a good show. We love the daring, we love the impractical, and we love anything that allows us to look up from our own small, difficult lives and imagine for just a moment that we could be anywhere else. Of course, the future of travel did not, in the end, belong to the clouds. Gravity, that most relentless of bill collectors, would eventually file its objection. It would do so with a fiery, catastrophic finality that would turn the dream of airship travel into a cautionary tale told to children to keep them from getting too big for their boots. But in 1929, that day was still hidden in the fog of the future. For now, there was only the cruise, the piano, and the millionaires, drifting serenely above the problems of a world that was about to undergo a very different kind of descent. There is something inherently brave about a man who boards an airship. He is saying, I choose to ignore the fundamental reality that I am a creature of the earth, and I choose to trust my life to the thin, invisible currents of the sky. It is a beautiful kind of stupidity. It is the kind of leap of faith that has pushed our species to discover new lands, invent new machines, and generally make a nuisance of ourselves across every corner of the globe. We aren't satisfied with the world as it is. We want to decorate it, navigate it, and occasionally try to fly over it regardless of the consequences. As the Graf completed its circuit, returning to its hangar with the weary, triumphal satisfaction of a bird that has flown a bit further than it intended, it left behind a world that was just a little bit more convinced of its own modernity. We had seen the future, and it was a silver cigar with a piano inside. We had seen the world from the heights, and we had decided that we liked the view. We were drunk on the idea of our own ingenuity, and we were blissfully unaware that the music was about to stop. It is a pity, in a way. The airship was a far more elegant, a far more whimsical, and a far more poetic way to travel than the cramped, noisy, and utterly soulless aluminum tubes that we use today. There was something about the Graf that spoke to the dreamer in us. It wasn't about getting from point A to point B as quickly as possible. It was about the journey itself. It was about the act of drifting, the act of observing, and the act of believing that we could exist in a realm that wasn't meant for us. Looking back at the year 1929, I find myself thinking of those passengers, their faces pressed against the glass, their ears filled with the sound of a piano playing in the middle of the sky. They were so high above the earth, and yet they were just as vulnerable to the coming crash as the rest of us. They were riding on a cushion of air, but the cushion was about to be pulled out from under the entire world. It is the ultimate human irony. We spend our lives building towers, launching airships, and dreaming of the heights, all the while standing on a floor that is already beginning to crack. And yet, for 21 days, those millionaires were the kings of the sky, and who among us wouldn't trade their own comfortable, grounded life for a chance to play a piano in the clouds, if only for an hour, before the gravity of reality finally caught up with us? Chapter 8. The Birth of 7-Up, the Lithiated Lemonade. It is a well-established fact of the human condition that we are a nervous, twitchy, and profoundly dissatisfied lot. We spend our days chasing after things that will not make us happy, and our nights worrying about the things we have already managed to lose. If there were a patron saint for the American citizen in the year 1929, he would surely be a man who is simultaneously checking his watch, counting his change, and looking over his shoulder for the bill collector. It was a year of high anxiety, a year where the collective heart of the nation was beating a little too fast, and the collective mind was searching quite desperately for a way to turn down the volume. Enter one Mr. Charles Liper Grigg, a man of profound marketing intuition and a chemist's understanding of the modern temperament. Mr. Grigg decided that the solution to our national malaise was not to be found in philosophy, nor in religion, nor in the dry, dusty pamphlets of the government. No, the solution was to be found in a bottle of pop. He invented a concoction he dubbed bib-label lithiated lemon-lime soda, a title that sounds less like a refreshing beverage and more like a prescription for a particularly stubborn case of melancholia. Now, you might ask why a man would choose to put lithiated in the name of a lemonade. It is a fair question, and it speaks to the genius of the age. Lithium citrate, as any gentleman of the laboratory could have told you, is a heavy-duty mood stabilizer. It is the sort of thing you give to a fellow when he has decided to start an argument with his own shadow, or when he has taken a sudden, inexplicable interest in the finer points of existential dread. Mr. Grigg, in a flash of brilliance that would make a medicine show huckster blush, decided that if people were going to be miserable, they might as well be miserable with a lemon-lime aftertaste. It is, when you stop to consider the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the thing, nothing short of marketing genius. Here we were, a nation on the brink of a financial precipice, our savings accounts as thin as a politician's promise, and our nerves as frayed as an old rug. And Mr. Grigg was offering us a way to drink our problems into a state of pleasant, bubbly oblivion. It was the mood-altering lemonade, the soft drink that doubled as a psychiatric intervention. One glass, and you felt a bit more like yourself. 2 glasses, and you didn't much care that the stock market was doing a swan dive into the depths of the Atlantic. I have often wondered if Mr. Grigg was a philosopher in disguise. He understood better than most that the average man does not want to be cured of his troubles. That would be far too much work. He simply wants to be distracted from them. He wants the illusion of contentment, a little bit of sparkle to mask the bitterness of the world. And what better way to achieve that than with a fizzy, lemony beverage that contains just enough of a chemical sedative to take the sharp edges off of reality? It was, in its own way, a noble project. He was doing his part to keep the nation from jumping into the river one swallow at a time. The beverage, of course, was an immediate success. It appealed to the businessman who needed to settle his stomach before a merger, the housewife who needed a moment of peace before the children came home from school, and the politician who needed to keep his hands from shaking during a press conference. It was the universal solvent for the 20th century soul. It promised refreshment, and it delivered a gentle, chemically assisted nudge toward a more optimistic outlook. One cannot help but laugh at the irony. We are living in an age of miracles, a time when we can send voices through the air and travel in silver cigars. Yet our most popular innovation is a drink that helps us endure the very world we have spent so much effort to create. We are building a modern civilization, a gleaming edifice of steel and light, and we are holding the whole thing together with sugar, carbonation, and a dash of medicinal salts. It is the most American solution imaginable. If life is giving you lemons, don't just make lemonade. Make sure it's lithiated. There is something deeply and profoundly whimsical about the way we curate our own reality. We know the drink contains a mood stabilizer, and we pretend it's just for the zip of the lemon lime. We know the world is heading toward a crash that will make our collective hair turn white, and we pretend that everything is just fine, provided we have a cold bottle of soda to wash down the worry. It is a delicate, fragile, and utterly necessary pretense. We are all participating in a great national game of let's pretend, and Mr. Grigg was the one who provided the refreshments for the party. I often think of those who sat at their kitchen tables in 1929, the newspaper spread out before them with headlines about market confidence and unprecedented growth, while they sipped their lithiated lemonade. They were tasting the future, a future that was in its own way both sweet and mildly numbing. They were drinking in the comfort, the distraction, and the temporary reprieve from the cold, hard facts of the ledger. They were, perhaps, the most sensible people in the room. They weren't fighting the tide, and they weren't trying to outrun the crash. They were simply enjoying their soda and waiting to see what the next bubble would look like. There is a lesson here, I suppose, for the historians who like to focus on the bankers and the generals. If you want to understand the true pulse of an era, don't look at the stock tickers or the election results. Look at the medicine cabinet, the kitchen pantry, and the local soda fountain. You will find that the real history of the world is written not in the grand, sweeping gestures of the powerful, but in the small, desperate, and often hilarious ways that ordinary people find to get through the day. We are, all of us, looking for our own little bottle of lithiated lemonade. We are all looking for that bit of sparkle, that hint of sweetness, and that gentle nudge toward a place where the world doesn't seem quite so heavy. We want to believe that there is a solution to our troubles, something that we can buy at the store, pop the top on, and feel for a moment that we are on top of the world. And if that solution happens to have a bit of chemistry in it, well, all the better. As I look back on 1929, the year the party ended, I find myself thinking of Mr. Grigg and his invention with a strange, lingering fondness. He was a man of his time, a man who saw the shadows lengthening across the land and decided that if he couldn't bring the light, he would at least provide a refreshing way to sit in the dark. It was a charming, slightly absurd, and ultimately human endeavor. We are a species that likes to bubble, and as long as we have our lemon lime, I suppose we can weather just about any storm that the heavens, or the market, decide to throw our way. Just be sure to read the label, keep your glass filled, and remember that when the ticker tape turns to confetti, the only thing that really matters is that the drink stays cold and the bubbles keep rising to the top. Chapter 9. The Yo-Yo Epidemic. If there is any activity more perfectly designed to highlight the fundamental lunacy of the human species than the yo-yo, I have yet to encounter it. Consider the thing, a wooden disc connected by a string to a human finger, which is rhythmically cast downward only to return, with predictable and often monotonous, obedience to the hand. It is, for all intents and purposes, a physical metaphor for the soul's struggle against the tyranny of gravity, or perhaps for the average taxpayer's relationship with the federal government. It falls, it lingers in a brief, suspended state of uncertainty, and then it is hauled back up, only to be tossed out again the moment it arrives. It is a hobby that asks nothing of the intellect, requires no specialized education, and offers no tangible benefit to the practitioner, save for a slight soreness in the forearm and a profound sense of having accomplished absolutely nothing of value. In the year of our Lord 1929, this simple wooden toy underwent a transformation that can only be described as a social contagion. Mr. Donald Duncan, a man who possessed the kind of aggressive commercial optimism that usually precedes a spectacular bankruptcy, decided to purchase a small, struggling toy company and introduce his branded Duncan yo-yo to the American public. Within a matter of weeks, the nation was gripped by what can only be described as a yo-yo epidemic. Grown men in suits, women in flapper dresses, and children whose eyes were wider than the discs themselves were all suddenly fascinated by a piece of string and some painted wood. It was as if a dormant gene, one that had been lurking in the shadows of our evolutionary history since we first decided to stop swinging from trees and start walking upright, had suddenly been activated by the hypnotic, rhythmic click-clack of the toy. I have stood on the street corners of major cities and observed the spectacle. There is something profoundly, deliciously absurd about watching a bank teller, a man whose life is defined by the rigid, joyless accounting of other people's fortunes, standing outside his place of business during a lunch break, feverishly working a yo-yo. He looks at it with a gaze of intense, almost religious concentration. He is not merely playing, he is in conversation with the laws of motion. He is testing the limits of centrifugal force. Or perhaps he is just trying to see if he can make it sleep at the bottom of the string for 3 seconds longer than his rival. There is a gravity to his demeanor that would be appropriate if he were orchestrating a naval maneuver, and yet he is merely engaging in the most futile, repetitive, and ultimately pointless gesture imaginable. It is, perhaps, the perfect metaphorical preview of what the stock market is about to do. We were all tossing our money into the market, watching it plummet downward and hoping, with the irrational fervor of the true believer, that it would eventually return to our hands. The market, however, is a much less reliable toy than a Duncan. When you toss your life savings into the hands of a broker on a 10% margin, you are playing a game where the string is prone to snapping and the disc is prone to disappearing into the gutter of history. But the yo-yo players of 1929 didn't know that. They were too busy perfecting the around the world or the walk the dog. They were too busy enjoying the sensation of control that comes from a toy that, for all its movement, never actually goes anywhere. There is a lesson here, I suppose, about the nature of distraction. We are a species that is terrified of a quiet room or a vacant mind. We are so afraid of our own thoughts and so intimidated by the impending reality of a collapsing global economy that we will happily preoccupy ourselves with any shiny, rhythmic, or mildly irritating gadget that comes along. The yo-yo was the perfect antidote to the anxiety of the age. It was a tangible, graspable distraction. It provided a sense of rhythm in a world that was rapidly losing its own. It turned the nervous energy of a nation into a harmless, repetitive motion. If we were all busy trying to make our wooden discs do tricks, we wouldn't have time to notice that the foundation of our entire prosperity was beginning to sound like a bowl of dry cornflakes being crushed under a heavy boot. Mr. Duncan, for his part, was a genius of the highest order. He understood that you don't sell a toy, you sell a movement. He organized competitions, he sent out demonstrators, and he turned a solitary pastime into a competitive spectacle. He tapped into that uniquely American need to be the best at something, even if that something is the equivalent of beating a drum at a funeral. People practiced for hours. They developed calluses on their fingers. They argued about the tension of the string and the balance of the axle with the passion of theologians arguing about the nature of the Trinity. It was a craze that consumed the headlines, the sidewalk conversations, and the very air of the American city. One cannot help but smile at the thought of it. Here we were, standing on the precipice of the greatest financial catastrophe in the history of the world, and the most pressing issue in the country was whether one should use a cotton or a silk string for maximum performance. It is the ultimate testament to the resilience, or perhaps the density, of the human spirit. We will dance on the deck of the Titanic if the band is playing the right tune, and we will walk the dog with a wooden toy while the banking system is being liquidated by the forces of entropy. We are, at our core, children who have been given too much credit and not enough common sense. I often think of Theoyo as the mascot of 1929. It is a toy that promises motion without progress. It is a toy that relies entirely on a tether, a limitation that keeps the player firmly in place even as the object of his obsession races toward the ground. It is the perfect icon for a decade that spent its best years trying to climb higher, only to realize that it was attached to a string that was already reaching its limit. When the crash finally came, when the music stopped and the lights went out, I suspect that many of those people who had spent their summer perfecting their sleeper were left standing in the ruins, wondering why the toy had stopped returning to their hands. But in the meantime, it was a grand, hilarious, and utterly pointless adventure. It was a year of rhythm and sound. It was a year of calloused fingers and bruised egos. It was a year where the nation collectively decided to ignore the writing on the wall and focus instead on the movement of the disc. We were all yo-yo players, casting our bets into the void and praying that the string would hold, that the momentum would carry, and that we would be able to catch the prize before the next gravity-defying drop. And so we played. We played until our fingers ached, and we played until the sun went down, and we played right up until the very moment that the world changed and the string snapped for good. It was a marvelous, foolish, and deeply human display of focus in the face of oblivion. If I had to choose a monument to the spirit of 1929, a statue to represent our collective folly, I would not choose a banker, nor a politician, nor a general. I would choose a common citizen, standing on a street corner, casting a piece of painted wood toward the pavement, eyes wide with the desperate childish hope that it would, against all laws of physics and common sense, come back again. It is a beautiful image, really, if you have the stomach for irony. We are all just trying to keep the disc spinning, aren't we? And as long as we can keep it moving, we can almost convince ourselves that we are actually in control of the direction of the string, which is perhaps the most important trick of them all. Chapter 10. Hubble's Velocity, the Running Universe. If there is one thing that the human race has always prided itself on, it is our perceived centrality. From the dawn of time, we have looked up at the night sky, that great black velvet curtain draped over our little stage, and convinced ourselves that the lights hanging there were merely footlights, installed specifically to illuminate our own self-important drama. We have spent centuries constructing elaborate cosmologies, architectural marvels of the imagination, all designed to prove that the Earth is the immovable pivot upon which the entire celestial machine turns. And yet, there is nothing quite so humbling as the realization that the universe, far from being a stationary backdrop for our exploits, is in fact running away from us as fast as it possibly can. In 1929, an astronomer by the name of Edwin Hubble, a man who possessed the kind of patience that would have driven a lesser mortal to drink, published his empirical data. He had been peering through the great glass eye at Mount Wilson, spending his nights in the thin, frigid air of the mountain, looking at the distant, ghostly nebulae. He had been measuring the light, analyzing the shifting colors, and doing the sort of meticulous, painstaking work that makes the rest of our daily efforts look like the scribblings of a distracted toddler. And what he found was enough to send the theologians, the philosophers, and the egoists of the world into a collective, bewildered silence. The universe, he discovered, is expanding. It is not sitting still. It is not waiting for us to catch up. The further away a galaxy is, the faster it is sprinting toward the exit, receding from our vantage point with an urgency that is, frankly, alarming. Every star in the sky, every swirling island of light, is currently engaged in a frantic, universal game of tag, and we are the only ones standing still, clutching our telescopes and wondering where everyone has gone. It is a revelation of such profound and cosmic proportions that one almost feels the urge to pack a suitcase and join the exodus. I find the humor in this to be quite exquisite. We are so obsessed with our own local disputes, our own national borders, and our own petty financial crises, while the very fabric of reality is stretching itself thin, as if trying to get as far away from the human race as mathematically possible. One cannot help but sympathize with the galaxies. If I were a swirling, luminous collection of billions of stars, and I caught a glimpse of the neighborhood in which we reside, with our wars, our politicians, our yo-yos, and our lithiated lemonades, I, too, would be looking for the nearest trapdoor and accelerating toward the horizon. The universe is not just expanding, it is, in a very real sense, rejecting us. The scientific community, of course, reacted with the kind of stiff-necked intellectual rigidity that has defined the Academy since the days of Galileo. They held their conferences, they adjusted their instruments, and they debated the implications of the running universe with the fervor of people who have just discovered that the floor of their house is actually a treadmill. It was a marvelous show of intellectual stubbornness. They wanted to hold on to the old idea, the comfortable idea, the idea that the universe was a finite, static, and orderly place that behaved according to the rules of the local parlor. But the data was as stubborn as a mule. The light was shifting, the speed was increasing, and the cosmos was quite clearly in the midst of a grand celestial getaway. Consider the implications for the vanity of the species. We have built our cathedrals and our universities, our stock exchanges and our monuments, all on the assumption that we are the protagonists of the story. And now we discover that the stage itself is being dismantled, that the scenery is fleeing in every direction, and that the play has already moved to a different theater entirely. We are like the guests at a party who have stayed 3 hours past the time the music stopped, only to realize that the host has already packed up the furniture, moved to the suburbs, and changed his telephone number. I suspect that the common man, when he heard this news, didn't really care. He had his own problems. He had the rent to pay, the butcher to appease, and the worry that the market might be having a bit of an off day. To him, the fact that a galaxy a billion light-years away was moving at an incomprehensible speed was about as relevant as the price of tea in Timbuktu. But there is a certain wisdom in that indifference. We are small, we are temporary, and we are quite possibly the only creatures in the vast, empty expanse of the cosmos who are foolish enough to spend our nights worrying about the distance to the stars instead of the distance to the local tavern, Hubble himself must have felt a strange, detached satisfaction. He had looked into the dark, and the dark had told him a secret that nobody wanted to hear. He had stripped away the last veneer of our cosmic importance. We are not the center. We are not the target. We are merely the leftover dregs of a cosmic explosion drifting in a backwater corner of a reality that is busy stretching itself to the point of absurdity. It is a humbling thought, but it is also a liberating one. If the universe is expanding, if everything is running away from everything else, then why should we be so concerned with the narrow, stifling constraints of our own earthly lives? Why not let go of the tether, let go of the margin, and let go of the weight of our own expectations? There is something whimsical about the idea of a universe that is constantly redefining its own boundaries. It is a universe that refuses to be labeled, a universe that refuses to be static, and a universe that is, by its very nature, a work in progress. It is a messy, beautiful, and fundamentally chaotic place, and we are just a tiny, microscopic smudge on the surface of one of its more inconsequential pebbles. And yet, for all our insignificance, we have the capacity to look up, to measure, and to wonder. That is our redeeming feature. That is the one thing that makes us worth keeping, even if the rest of the cosmos is trying to put as much distance between us as possible. As I sit here, looking back at that year of hubris, that year of the crash, that year when we thought we had finally mastered the earth, the discovery of the expanding universe stands out as the ultimate irony. We were so proud of our growth, our expansion, our new era of prosperity, while the entire cosmos was demonstrating that growth is the natural state of existence, and that it is almost always followed by a thinning of the fabric. The universe was expanding into the void, and we were expanding into a debt that could never be repaid. I suspect that the stars have the right idea. They are drifting apart, cooling down, and eventually they will go out, leaving the universe to the silence and the cold. It is a dignified ending, much more dignified than the one we had prepared for ourselves. We were busy panicking about the price of steel, while the universe was busy contemplating the end of time. It is, perhaps, the most important lesson of all, that no matter how hard we try to hold things together, no matter how hard we try to build our little structures of permanence, the nature of reality is to drift. We are all running away from something, and if the galaxies are any indication, we are all eventually going to get exactly where we are going. And the view, I suspect, will be quite spectacular, even if there is no one left to witness it. So let the universe run, let it stretch, let it fade, and let it carry on its lonely, magnificent flight. We, at least, had the chance to look up and see it moving, and that, in a world that is losing its grip, is surely enough. Chapter 11. The Skeleton Dance. There is a certain brand of high-minded critic, the sort of person who wears a monocle to look at a soup menu and considers laughter a symptom of a weak constitution, who insists that the arts should be a mirror held up to the noble aspirations of humanity. They want symphonies that sound like the rattling of heaven's gates, and portraits that capture the soulful agony of the common man. I, however, have always held that the highest achievement of any art form is its ability to take a perfectly terrifying subject, like the inevitable decay of the human frame, and turn it into a tap-dancing routine. In the year 1929, a gentleman named Walt Disney, a man who understood that if you draw enough lines on a piece of paper and flip them fast enough, you can convince the public that anything is alive, released the first of his silly symphony cartoons. He titled it The Skeleton Dance. It was a masterpiece of the morbid, a delightful ink-stained romp featuring 4 skeletons who jump out of their graves at the stroke of midnight to perform a musical number that would have made a Victorian undertaker faint dead away. It was, in short, the most honest piece of theater produced that entire decade. Consider the spectacle. 4 calcium-heavy gentlemen stripped of their vanity, their pretensions, and their trousers, deciding that the only sensible thing to do after a long, quiet slumber in the dirt is to have a bit of a shindig. They use each other as musical instruments, knocking their femurs against their ribs like a xylophone player gone mad, and they move with a frantic, disjointed elegance that defies all the usual rules of anatomy. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that ink, a clever animator, and a bit of synchronized sound can turn a graveyard into the most profitable dance hall in town. There is something inherently humorous about death when you strip away the black crape and the weeping relatives. When you look at it closely, death is really just the final release from the crushing burden of having to be dignified. The skeletons in Disney's cartoon aren't worried about their social standing, the stock market, or the price of oats. They are just enjoying the fact that they have finally lost their skin and can spend the rest of the night practicing their jazz steps. It is a liberating thought. We spend our lives trying to keep our bones covered up and our joints oiled, only to discover that the afterlife is essentially an open mic night for the rhythmically inclined. The corporate doctrine established by this little film is one that the business world has been trying to emulate ever since. Death is no excuse to stop performing. Even when you are down to your bare essentials, even when you have been buried for a century, there is still a show to be put on. It is a philosophy that fits perfectly with the American spirit. We are a nation that refuses to let the curtain fall, even when the stage is collapsing. We will keep dancing, we will keep humming, and we will keep tapping our knuckles against our rib cages until the morning sun forces us back into the soil. It is the ultimate "the show must go on" attitude, applied with a gruesome, whimsical flair. One imagines the animators at the studio hunched over their desks, drawing thousands of tiny, rattling frames of bone and shadow. They were not aiming for profound truth. They were aiming for a giggle. And yet, they achieved something much deeper. They touched upon the fundamental, ridiculous reality that we are all at heart just a collection of sticks held together by habit, waiting for the music to start so we can show off our moves. The public loved it. They flocked to the theaters, eager to see the skeletons cavort, and they laughed with a wild, slightly hysterical energy that was perfectly suited to the year 1929. The world was getting shaky, the foundations were cracking, and we were all beginning to feel the floorboards give way. Why not watch a cartoon about the one thing we all have in common? It is the mark of a truly great, or at least truly clever, civilization that it can find the humor in the abyss. We were living through a time of unprecedented change. The roaring 20s were gasping for air, the clouds were gathering, and the great, inevitable disappointment was looming just around the corner. and we decided to respond by animating the dead. We wanted to see if we could make the ghosts dance. It was a defiant act of joy in the face of a reality that was becoming increasingly bleak. If we are all destined for the grave, we might as well make sure that the grave has a decent orchestra and a well-lit stage. I often think of those skeletons whenever I hear a politician talk about permanent values or a banker talk about guaranteed returns. They are trying so hard to build their little towers of permanence, trying so hard to preserve their skin, their reputation, and their assets, all while the clock is ticking down to the final bow. They are fighting the rhythm, trying to keep their bones still, while the rest of us are realizing that the only way to survive the night is to loosen our joints and join the dance. The skeletons are the true realists. They know that once you've lost everything, you have nothing left to fear, and you are finally free to rattle your bones as loud as you like. The technical achievement of the cartoon should not be overlooked, though it is the spirit of the thing that truly matters. To match the sound to the image, to have the click of a knuckle perfectly synced with the beat of a jazz tune, was a revolution. It meant that the imaginary world could finally speak to us in our own language. It meant that we could build a bridge between the cold, hard silence of the grave and the warm, noisy reality of the living. Disney had figured out that if you give a ghost a trumpet and a decent beat, he becomes the most engaging character on the screen. He had tapped into the universal desire to see the impossible, to laugh at the taboo, and to find a bit of grace in the midst of the macabre. As the decade drew to its close and the shadows of the great crash began to lengthen, the skeleton dance remained as a defiant little artifact of a world that hadn't yet realized the gravity of its situation. We were still in the era of the silly symphony, still convinced that if we just kept the tempo up, we could dance our way through the coming fire. We were a nation of animated skeletons, rattling our way toward a future we couldn't yet see, and we were having a marvelous time doing it. It is a pity that we cannot all be so composed in the face of the inevitable. We worry so much about the presentation, the decor, and the dignity of our departure, when we should be focusing on the quality of our performance. Life, I have found, is not about the amount of meat on your bones. It is about the fluidity of your movement and the rhythm of your rattling. If you can manage to jump out of your grave, find a partner, and perform a halfway decent waltz under the light of the moon, you have done better than most of the people who are currently running the world. So let us raise a glass to those 4 dancing skeletons. Let us celebrate their lack of vanity and their devotion to the beat. They are the only ones who truly understand that the end of the show is just the beginning of the real party. And if, when your time comes, you find yourself staring at a patch of dirt and wondering what to do next, just listen for the musics. It's always playing somewhere, and it's always asking for one more number. Just remember to keep your ribs loose, your movement sharp, and for heaven's sake, don't let a little thing like being dead stop you from enjoying the rhythm. After all, if the skeletons can keep their cool and their choreography in the middle of a graveyard, surely we, with all our skin and our worries, can manage to do the same in the middle of the mess we call 1929. Chapter 12. The First Car Radio. If there is one thing that the American character cannot abide, it is the silence of the open road. We are a people who require a constant, rhythmic, and preferably brassy accompaniment to our wanderings. We want to hear the news, the jazz, the weather, and the advertisements for patent medicines that promise to cure everything from a broken heart to a stubborn mule, all while we are hurtling across the landscape at a speed that would have convinced our grandfathers that the world was surely coming to an end. It was only a matter of time, therefore, before someone decided that the dashboard of an automobile was not merely a place to keep a clock and a speedometer, but the perfect home for a wireless telegraphy set. In the late months of 1929, the Galvin brothers, men of a singular, forward-thinking ambition, decided to wedge a radio into the dashboard of a motor car. They named it the Motorola, a title that sounds like a cross between a Roman gladiator and a breakfast cereal, and they unleashed it upon a public that was at that very moment obsessed with the idea of making the inside of a car feel like the inside of a living room. It was a revelation. It was the invention of the driving soundtrack, the birth of the radio advertisement while driving, and the final nail in the coffin of the contemplative silence that had, until that point, been one of the few remaining luxuries of travel. The traditionalists, of course, were horrified. They were a nervous, hand-wringing collection of people who looked at a motor car and saw a death trap, and they looked at a car radio and saw a recipe for a global catastrophe. They argued, with the shrill urgency of a school marm spotting a student smoking behind the gym, that music in a car would distract the driver, cause accidents, and generally lead to the complete moral and physical disintegration of the motoring public. They claimed that a man could not possibly keep his eyes on the dirt road and his ears on the latest hit from the Chicago jazz circuit without finding himself sooner or later wrapped around the trunk of an oak tree. I find their alarmist attitude to be quite delicious. It is the same reaction that people have had to every major technological leap since we first discovered that fire was good for cooking, provided you didn't set the rug on fire in the process. They were missing the point entirely. They were focused on the risk of the accident, while the public was focused on the thrill of the freedom. What is a minor fender bender compared to the sheer, undeniable joy of driving a car at 60 miles per hour on a road that was clearly intended for a horse and buggy, while listening to a live broadcast of a crooner singing about his lost love? It is the exact definition of modern freedom. It is the ability to surround oneself with one's own private, portable reality, even while hurtling through the public domain of the countryside. The Motorola was not just a device. It was a psychological barrier. When you turned the dial, you were no longer just a man in a machine. You were a citizen of the airwaves. You could be in the middle of a dusty Nebraska field, miles from the nearest telegraph pole, and yet you were connected to the entire humming nervous system of the nation. You could hear the ticker-tape reports, the stock market updates, and the latest gossip from the urban centers, all while the wind whipped past your ears and the dust settled on your coat. It was a way of conquering space and time, a way of insisting that even in the most remote corners of the map, you were never truly alone and never truly disconnected from the source of the noise. One imagines the first drivers who installed these infernal contraptions. They must have felt like magicians. They would pull their cars over to the side of the road, lean out the window, adjust the antenna, and suddenly, through the crackle and the static, there would be the voice of a man in New York, clear as a bell, talking about the weather. They would smile, nod their heads, and drive on, convinced that they were at the very pinnacle of human achievement. They were part of a new aristocracy, the aristocracy of the airwaves. They were the people who could travel and listen at the same time, the multitasking titans of the new century who had decided that the world was simply too large and too empty to be experienced without a running commentary. Of course, the Galvin brothers were not just selling a radio. They were selling a dream. They were selling the dream of a world where you never have to be alone with your own thoughts. They were selling the idea that you can be on the go and in the know simultaneously, a concept that has since become the defining religion of our times. If we aren't listening, are we really moving? If we aren't being entertained by the invisible voices of the city, are we really driving? It is a question that the modern age has answered with a resounding, and if I might say so, a rather loud no. It is all quite funny when you step back and look at it. We are a species that is terrified of our own inner monologue. We are so afraid of what we might think if we were forced to drive for 3 hours without a broadcast to drown out our consciousness, that we have built an entire industry dedicated to the continuous, repetitive, and occasionally insightful bombardment of our senses. The car radio was the first move in this game, the opening gambit in our ongoing war against silence, and look at where it has led us. We have televisions in our headrests. We have satellite signals in our trunks, and we have global connectivity in our palms. We have banished silence from the human experience as if it were a plague-bearing rat, and we have replaced it with a constant shimmering layer of background noise. The critics were right about one thing. It is a distraction. But it is a distraction that we have chosen with open arms and empty minds. We wanted to be distracted. We wanted to be entertained. We wanted to believe that the world was happening to us through our speakers rather than forcing us to look at the landscape through our windshields. We wanted the illusion of participation, and we were willing to pay for it in batteries, tubes, and the occasional loss of situational awareness. As the year 1929 rolled on, a year that would eventually be defined by the sound of breaking glass and falling tickers, the car radio became the symbol of a nation that was moving at an unsustainable velocity. We were listening to the music, we were watching the road, and we were pretending that as long as we were connected to the pulse of the country, we were safe from the impending disaster. We were driving into the future with the volume turned up, and we were convinced that no matter how steep the grade, as long as we could hear the jazz, we would find our way home. I suppose there is a certain kind of beauty in that. It is the beauty of the doomed, the beauty of the traveler who knows that the map is wrong, but decides to keep driving anyway, just for the sake of the ride. We are all Galvin brothers in a sense. We are all trying to figure out how to squeeze a little bit more noise into a little bit more machine, hoping that if we can just make it loud enough, the truth won't be able to catch up with us. And maybe, in a world that is spinning as fast as ours, that is the only way to get through. You turn the dial, you find a station that doesn't sound too much like a funeral, and you hit the gas. The rest is just static. The roads were long, the tires were thin, and the engines were temperamental, but the music was always playing. That is the American way, I suppose. We don't care where the road ends, as long as the radio is tuned in, the tank is full, and we're too busy humming along to notice the signs that say dead end until we've already driven right past them. It's a wonderful, reckless, and perfectly logical way to go if you happen to be in a hurry to get nowhere in particular at a very high rate of speed. And that, after all, is exactly what we were doing in 1929. We were driving into history, and we wanted to make sure we had the proper soundtrack for the crash. Chapter 13, The Prophet of the Crash, the Babson Warning. If there is one thing a man should never do in the company of a group of people who are currently engaged in the lucrative business of getting rich, it is to suggest that their entire enterprise is a sham. It is a social error on par with pointing out that the emperor's new tailor has not, in fact, included any fabric in his latest design. In the sunny, optimistic, and entirely delusional month of September 1929, a financial analyst by the name of Roger Babson, a man who had the unfortunate habit of reading arithmetic tables when everyone else was busy reading the tea leaves, committed this very error. He stood before a room of his peers, a collection of investors and speculators who were currently riding the great bull market toward the stratosphere, and uttered the unspeakable, "Sooner or later a crash is coming, and it may be a terrific one." It was a sentiment of such profound and inconvenient accuracy that the audience, had they been made of sterner stuff, might have paused to check their ledgers. But the stock market, as I have observed, is not a creature of reason. It is a creature of collective, fevered imagination. To suggest that the market might crash was not viewed as a helpful piece of financial advice. It was viewed as a personal insult, a heresy, and a failure of patriotism. The financial press, always eager to protect the sensibilities of the investment class, immediately went to work. They called Mr. Babson a lunatic, a killjoy, and a traitor to the spirit of progress. They insisted that we were in a new era, a time when the old rules of economics had been successfully overruled by the sheer force of American ingenuity and a very generous supply of credit. It is a fascinating, whimsical, and deeply human display of stubbornness. We have a way of treating financial markets as if they were a deity that must be appeased with constant, unwavering faith. If you believe in the market will provide. If you doubt the market will punish. And Mr. Babson, by daring to express his doubts, had become the local blasphemer, the man who had dared to shout "Fire!" in a crowded theater, because he happened to notice that the curtains were currently engulfed in flames. The critics were particularly annoyed because Mr. Babson actually knew how to read a table of figures. He had looked at the margins, he had looked at the interest rates, and he had looked at the way that dentists, shoe-shine boys, and retired school teachers were all borrowing money from banks to buy stocks that were already priced at levels that defied the laws of common sense. He saw the structure for what it was, a multi-billion-dollar game of musical chairs where the music was being provided by a failing ticker tape. But to point out the mechanics of the game is to ruin the fun, and nobody likes a party pooper. One cannot help but admire the sheer, unadulterated hubris of the investment class. They were convinced that they had outsmarted history. They thought that because they had invented the radio, the car, and the motion picture, they had also invented a way to create wealth out of nothing. They had successfully decoupled the stock price from the reality of the business, turning the exchange into a giant sparkling casino, where the house was not only willing to let you win, but was practically begging you to take a loan to double your bets. And then along comes Mr. Babson, a man with a slide rule and a cold, hard look in his eye to remind them that gravity is not a suggestion. It is a law. The press coverage of the Babson warning was a comedy in its own right. They didn't just disagree with him, they ridiculed him. They made him the punchline of every financial column in the country. They used words like melancholy and gloomy, as if they were scientific terms for economic incompetence. It was as if they believed that if you simply called a man a crank, you could effectively insulate the market from the reality of its own overextension. It was the ostrich strategy of national finance. If you bury your head in the sand of high-priced steel stocks, the eventual collapse simply cannot find you. I find myself thinking of Mr. Babson often. He is the patron saint of the person who is right at the wrong time. There is no lonelier position in the world than standing on the deck of a ship, pointing at the oncoming waves while everyone else is busy congratulating themselves on how smooth the sailing has been. He was the man who looked at the ledger and saw the tragedy, while everyone else was looking at the profit margins and seeing the triumph. And he was right, of course. He was so spectacularly, undeniably right that it makes one wonder why we bother with profits at all, when we are clearly so intent on ignoring them until the very last possible second. The financial press, however, was not content to leave it at ridicule. They had to go further. They had to reassure the public that the fundamentals were sound, that the economy was robust, and that the only thing that could possibly cause a decline would be unwarranted fear itself. It is a brilliant piece of psychological deflection, is it not? Blame the man who points out the danger for the danger itself. If the market crashes, it isn't because the market was built on a foundation of fairy dust. It's because a few killjoys like Mr. Babson had the audacity to talk about the possibility of a downturn. It is the sort of logic that would make a fox smile in the middle of a chicken coop. As September gave way to October, the Babson warning became a sort of dark, persistent joke. When the market would flutter, someone would jokingly ask, "Is that the Babson crash?" And everyone would laugh, secure in the knowledge that the market was, in fact, invincible. It was the collective nervous laughter of a room full of people who are trying to convince themselves that the lights will never go out. They were whistling in the dark, and they were whistling with all their might, hoping that the sheer volume of their optimism would be enough to keep the truth at bay. One must understand that in 1929, the concept of a crash had become a quaint, archaic idea, like a steam-powered carriage or a corset. It was something that happened in the bad old days, before we had refined the art of the modern economy. We were the masters of the universe, and we had no intention of allowing a bunch of numbers on a page to dictate our success. We were writing our own history, and we were writing it in gold ink, even if the ink was currently being bought on borrowed time. It is a tragic, beautiful, and fundamentally human predicament. We love our illusions. We love the feeling of being on a winning streak, and we hate anything that threatens to pull us back to the reality of the earth. We are built for hope, and we are remarkably efficient at filtering out any evidence that suggests our hope might be misplaced. Mr. Babson was a thorn in the side of the American dream, a reminder that the world is a place of cycles, of rises, and of inevitable, grinding falls. And for his trouble, he was labeled a fool by the very people who were about to lose their shirts. I suppose that is the price you pay for being able to read. If you insist on looking at the evidence, you lose the ability to participate in the collective dream. You are forced to stand on the sidelines, watching the clock tick down, knowing exactly when the hammer is going to fall, while everyone else is busy dancing on the tables. It is a lonely, cold, and entirely thankless profession. And yet, I can't help but think that Mr. Babson might have had the last laugh. If only he had been the sort of man who took pleasure in saying, "I told you so." But he wasn't. He was just a man with a table of figures, looking at a world that was determined to fall, and he was the only one honest enough to say it out loud. The market would crash, the trapdoor would open, the ticker would fail, and when the dust finally settled, when the shoe-shine boys were no longer buying stocks, and the bankers were no longer walking onto the floor to project confidence, the Babson warning would be remembered not as a crank's delusion, but as one of the few lonely voices of sanity in a year that had completely, utterly, and brilliantly lost its mind. It is a lesson in the fragility of consensus. Sometimes the man who is laughed out of the room is the only one who has actually bothered to check if the room has a floor. And that, in an age of miracles and margins, is a lesson worth holding on to, even if the rest of the world is busy trying to outrun the gravity of its own greed. Chapter 14. The Hotry Crisis in London. If you ever wish to observe the interconnected nature of human folly, I highly recommend keeping a weather eye on the London Stock Exchange. It is a venerable institution, steeped in the kind of tradition that suggests that even a financial disaster should be conducted with a stiff upper lip, a spot of tea, and a degree of decorum that would make a butler proud. However, in the autumn of 1929, the English financial world found itself in a rather unseemly scramble, all because a gentleman named Clarence Hatry decided that the best way to manage his affairs was to engage in a bit of creative bookkeeping that would have made a circus magician blush. Mr. Hatry was a financier of the sort that populates the darker, more interesting corners of history, a man of immense charm, infinite ambition, and a complete disregard for the tedious inconvenience of actual assets. He had built a small empire on the foundation of confidence, or to be a bit more precise, on the foundation of forged certificates and stolen identities. He was, in essence, an artist of the ledger, a man who treated the balance sheet not as a record of reality, but as a canvas upon which he could paint his own optimistic version of the truth. But alas, even the most talented painter eventually runs out of canvas, and in late 1929, Mr. Hatry's canvas was beginning to look remarkably thin. When the news of his arrest for forgery and fraud finally broke, it hit the London Stock Exchange with all the grace and subtlety of a grand piano falling down a flight of marble stairs. It was not merely a scandal, it was an international appetizer, a quiet, polite, and thoroughly British warning of the massive American-sized main course that was even then being prepared in the kitchen of history. The London markets, which had been basking in a comfortable, if somewhat stagnant sense of post-war stability, suddenly found themselves gripped by a panic that was as contagious as the measles and twice as rapid. One must admire the efficiency of a good panic. It is a psychological marvel. One moment, everyone is sitting in their clubs, drinking their sherry, and discussing the merits of the British Empire, and the next moment, the entire lot of them are standing on the floor of the exchange, sweating through their pin-striped waistcoats and trying to sell their holdings to a market that has suddenly developed a profound and very expensive allergic reaction to the concept of ownership. Assets were frozen, values evaporated into the ether, and the gentlemen of London discovered that their fortunes were not, as they had previously thought, secured by the bedrock of the city, but were floating on a very, very thin layer of trust. It is a curious thing about trust. It is the most valuable commodity in the world, and yet it is entirely intangible. You can hold a diamond in your hand, you can deposit a gold bar in a vault, but you cannot hold trust. You can only possess it until the very moment someone else decides you no longer deserve it, and then, like a ghost in a haunted mansion, it vanishes, leaving nothing behind but the cold, empty air of bankruptcy. Mr. Hatry had stolen the trust of London, and in doing so, he had effectively shut down the gears of the entire financial machine. It was a master class in how to disrupt an economy without firing a single shot. All you need is a fountain pen, a lack of conscience, and a group of investors who are too lazy to check the serial numbers on their certificates. I find the Hatry crisis to be a delightfully cynical interlude. It serves as a reminder that the world of high finance is not, as the boosters would have you believe, a rigorous, logical system of value creation. It is a social club. It is a collective agreement to pretend that the paper in our pockets is worth something and that the man sitting in the boardroom next door isn't currently forging his way to a private island in the Mediterranean. When that agreement is broken, when the secret is revealed, the entire edifice comes down with a speed that is truly breathtaking to behold. The panic in London was the first brick to fall out of the global chimney. It sent a tremor through the international markets, a nervous vibration that was felt all the way across the Atlantic, where the American investors were still busy doing their around-the-world yo-yo tricks and listening to their motorcar radios. They read about the Hatry scandal in the morning papers, scoffed at the British for their lack of market confidence, and then went right back to buying steel stocks on a 10% margin, convinced that such a thing could never happen to them. They were like a man watching his neighbor's house burn down, feeling a momentary sense of smug satisfaction that his own roof was made of fireproof tile, while failing to notice that his own house was currently filled with stacks of dry hay and soaked in lamp oil. The Hatry crisis exposed the rot. It showed that the entire international economy was built on a series of overlapping fragile bets, a house of cards where every card was relying on the strength of the one beneath it. If the Bank of England sneezed, the Federal Reserve caught a cold, and if a financier in London decided to commit a bit of fraud, the tremors were felt in every bank account from Chicago to Wall Street. It was a global system, but it was a system that functioned on the same principle as a row of dominoes, and we were all just waiting for someone to tip the first one. One wonders what Mr. Hatry thought of his own influence. Did he sit in his cell, feeling a sense of twisted pride? Did he realize that he had successfully brought the entire British financial system to its knees with a few strokes of his pen? It is a dangerous kind of power, the power to make the wealthy weep. He was, in his own way, a revolutionary. Not a revolutionary who sought to change the system, but a revolutionary who sought to expose it for the fragile, absurd, and entirely fraudulent construct that it really was. He was the man who turned on the lights in the middle of a masquerade ball and the sight of all those people scrambling to adjust their masks was, I must admit, a bit of a treat. The authorities, of course, were furious. They wanted to portray him as a singular villain, a bad apple who had spoiled the barrel. They didn't want the public to realize that the barrel was already full of spoiled fruit, and that Mr. Hattrey was simply the one who had finally decided to crack it open. They wanted to preserve the illusion of a system that was fundamentally sound, and they were willing to make a martyr out of Clarence Hattrey to do it. It is the perennial strategy of the establishment. Find a scapegoat, pin the blame on him, and then carry on as if nothing has changed. But something had changed. The confidence had been breached. The secret had been shared. The Hattrey crisis was a symptom of a larger disease, a disease of greed, recklessness, and the kind of unearned, unbridled arrogance that usually precedes a very hard fall. It was a warning, written in the ink of forged certificates and the tears of ruined investors. And it was a warning that the entire world decided to treat as a footnote. They were too busy, too confident, and too deeply invested in their own delusions to pay any mind to a bit of trouble in London. So, the markets in London stuttered, the investors panicked, and the establishment did its best to pretend that it was all just a minor hiccup in the otherwise glorious progression of the age. And meanwhile, across the ocean, the American dream continued to roar, the radio continued to play, and the yo-yos continued to spin. It is the tragedy of the human experience, I suppose. We never listen to the warnings, especially the ones that are written in our own language. We wait for the floor to drop out from under us, and only then do we realize that we should have been paying closer attention to the neighbor's house, and perhaps, just perhaps, to the man holding the pen at the desk next door. It's all a grand unfolding comedy. And the best part is that we never have to pay for the tickets until the very end, when the bill is finally presented, and we find that we don't have a penny left in our pockets to pay for the show. Chapter 15, The Mirage of the Margin. There is an old saying among those who frequent the racecourses of the world, though it applies with equal vigor to the marble halls of Wall Street. You can bet on the horse, you can bet on the jockey, but for heaven's sake, don't bet the money you need for your dinner, your rent, and your dignity. It is a sensible piece of advice, the sort of thing that a man might jot down on a scrap of paper and keep in his waistcoat for emergencies. But in the summer of 1929, the American public had collectively decided that dignity was a heavy, old-fashioned garment that didn't fit the current fashions, and that dinner was a trivial concern when compared to the intoxicating, shimmering promise of the ticker tape. We had successfully transformed the national economy into a multi-billion-dollar game of musical chairs, and the music was being provided by a failing, stuttering machine that was consistently behind the curve of reality. The central gimmick of this grand national farce was something called buying on margin. To the uninitiated, this sounds like a technical term from the world of publishing, but in the parlance of the investment class, it was essentially a license to gamble with other people's money. One would put down $10 of one's own, perhaps money intended for the children's school books or the mortgage, and the bank would graciously lend another $90, so that one might purchase $100 worth of stock. It is a beautiful system, provided the stock goes up. If it goes up, you are a genius, a titan of industry, and a man who has managed to outsmart the very laws of labor and reward. You pay back the bank, You pocket the difference, and you start planning your trip to the Riviera. But if the stock goes down, if it so much as flutters in the wrong direction, the bank comes calling with a margin call, which is a polite way of saying that you are about to be relieved of everything you possess, including the buttons on your shirt. It is a game of high stakes played by people who were, by and large, completely ill-equipped for the turbulence of the flight. By the time the warm breezes of July and August were sweeping through the city, the mania had reached a fever pitch that would have made the tulip-crazed Dutch of the 17th century look like a convention of sober conservative accountants. You had the shoe-shine boy at the corner, whose previous experience with finance was limited to the copper coins in his jar, offering hot tips on the performance of steel conglomerates. You had the school teacher, the dentist, and the plumber all gathered around the ticker-tape machine, their eyes glazed over with the same frantic, holy light that one might see in the eyes of a desert hermit who has been living on nothing but dust and visions. They were not investors. They were participants in a dream. They were living in a reality where the value of a company was not determined by the goods it produced, the efficiency of its workforce, or the soundness of its management, but by the intensity of the desire to possess its shares. It was a market driven entirely by the greater fool theory, the lovely, comforting, and ultimately fatal belief that no matter how high you pay for a stock, there will always be a greater fool waiting in the wings to buy it from you for a higher price. It is a wonderful philosophy, really, provided the supply of fools is infinite. Unfortunately, nature, in her infinite and occasionally cruel wisdom, has a way of capping the population of fools just when you need them most. I have spent a fair amount of time observing the manners and customs of the American people, and I have found that we are a nation that is deeply, painfully susceptible to the siren song of getting ahead. We are a nation of strivers. We are always looking for the shortcut, the golden road, the secret door that will lead us straight into the parlor of the wealthy without having to go through the indignity of the front hall. And the margin was our shortcut. It was the shiny golden key that promised us entry into the exclusive club of the idle rich. We didn't care that the key was made of tin or that the door led straight into a structural abyss. We just wanted to be inside. The absurdity of it was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. You could feel the static electricity in the streets. Everyone was talking about the market. It was the new religion. It had replaced the old quiet obsessions, baseball, politics, and the weather, with a singular, driving focus on the movement of numbers on a flickering screen. And the banks were the high priests, presiding over the ritual, lending the capital that kept the congregation in a state of perpetual, agitated grace. They were lending money they didn't have to people who couldn't afford to lose it on the premise that the future would be exactly like the past, only more so. It is a rare thing to see an entire nation decide simultaneously to suspend its capacity for common sense. You would think that, somewhere in the midst of this madness, a voice of reason would have emerged, a banker with a conscience or a journalist with a memory or perhaps a local sheriff who could see the folly of the thing. But no, the institutions were too busy, the press was too invested, and the people were too hopeful. They were all dancing. They were all in the middle of the most elaborate, well-choreographed, and completely suicidal dance in history, and they were all convinced that the orchestra was playing a tune that would last forever. One has to laugh at the sheer, unadulterated vanity of it all. We have built our civilization on the promise of rational action, on the belief that human beings are capable of learning from their mistakes and conducting their affairs with a modicum of prudence. And yet, here we were, in the year 1929, throwing our fortunes into a pile of paper and daring the heavens to strike us down. We were the masters of our own destiny, provided that destiny involved the endless upward movement of a line on a chart. We were the kings of the margin, and we were so very, very proud of ourselves. I suspect that the great looming disappointment of the coming autumn was necessary. It was the only thing that could have broken the spell. We had become so intoxicated by the mirage, so blinded by the golden haze of our own creation, that we had forgotten what it felt like to stand on solid ground. We were so busy watching the ticker that we had forgotten to watch the road. And when the crash finally came, when the music stopped, and the chairs were suddenly and violently removed, we would find ourselves standing in the middle of a room that was suddenly, terrifyingly empty. But for that summer, for those few frantic sun-drenched months, the illusion held. The shoe-shine boy still gave his tips, the dentist still kept his eyes on the tape between appointments, and the banks still kept their coffers open, pouring out the fuel for a fire that was already beginning to consume the house. It was a grand, hilarious, and ultimately tragic display of human hope. We were betting our futures on the idea that the world would never change, that the party would never end, and that we would always be able to find a greater fool than ourselves. It is a sad thing, really, to realize that we are so easy to fool. We are so desperate for a win that we will ignore the glaring signs of the end. We are so eager to believe in the shortcut that we will walk blindly into the trap. And the trap, in 1929, was a beauty. It was draped in the finest, most expensive silk. It smelled of success and expensive scars. And it was powered by the very desire that defines us all, the desire for something more, for something better, for something that we haven't quite earned, but that we are quite certain we deserve. So let us remember the mirage of the margin. Let us remember the summer when the entire nation tried to leap over the moon with a 10% down payment. It is a story that should be told to children, to students, and to anyone who thinks that the laws of finance are merely suggestions. It is the story of the time we forgot who we were, what we had, and what we were risking, all for the sake of a ticker tape that was already telling us the story of our own collapse. And yet, I must admit, there was a certain sparkling magic to it. We were all playing the game. We were all holding our breath, and for one brief, shining moment, we were all millionaires in the making, waiting for the tape to tell us that we had finally arrived at the promised land. It is a beautiful, foolish, and deeply, deeply human way to go, and it is no wonder we look back at it with a mixture of horror and nostalgia. We were having the time of our lives right up until the moment we weren't. Chapter 16. Black Thursday, the Broken Ticker. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when the collective pulse of a nation suddenly skips a beat. It is not a peaceful silence, mind you. It is a heavy, suffocating, and thoroughly disagreeable sort of quiet. It is the silence of a clock that has suddenly stopped ticking, or a ship's engine that has ceased its rhythmic thrumming in the middle of a vast and indifferent ocean. On the morning of October 24th, 1929, that silence descended upon the New York Stock Exchange. The market, which had spent the better part of the year dancing a frantic, dizzying jig, suddenly decided that it had had quite enough of the exercise and simply collapsed right through the floorboards of reality. The morning opened with a sense of unease that was as thick as a London fog in November. The previous days had been nervous, filled with the kind of erratic, twitchy movements that suggested the market was no longer in control of its own limbs. But Black Thursday, a name that sounds like the title of a particularly bleak penny dreadful, was different. The ticker-tape machines, those mechanical gossips that had spent the year whispering secrets of prosperity into the ears of every dentist, plumber, and bootblack in the country, suddenly began to choke. They could not keep up. The speed of the decline was so rapid, so steep, and so thoroughly unconcerned with the feelings of the shareholders that the machines simply sputtered, stalled, and eventually began to spit out a frantic, nonsensical jumble of ink and despair. It was, when you step back to consider the mechanics of it, a magnificent structural failure. We had built a world out of confidence, and when the confidence evaporated, the world itself simply ceased to hold its shape. The gentlemen on the floor of the exchange, those masters of the universe in their well-tailored suits, suddenly found themselves standing in a room where the rules of gravity had been suspended. They were looking at the boards, they were screaming into telephones, and they were, for the first time in their illustrious careers, realizing that they were not the architects of the disaster, but merely its most prominent and most fragile victims. The chaos was, in its own way, a work of art. You had men standing on the steps of the exchange, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the shock of a man who has just realized he has been playing with a loaded gun for 10 years and has finally managed to pull the trigger. You had the clerks, the messengers, and the frantic, desperate speculators all jostling for position, all trying to claw their way toward the exit, all trying to sell things that nobody, in their right mind, would ever want to buy. It was a riot of greed, a stampede of the self-assured, and it was playing out in the very heart of the financial capital of the world. And then, in a gesture of such profound and pathetic theater that it deserves to be etched into the annals of comedy, the titans of Wall Street decided to intervene. A group of the most powerful, most influential, and most fundamentally deluded bankers in the city walked onto the floor of the exchange. They didn't come with a plan. They came with a pile of cash. They began to purchase steel stocks at prices that were, by any rational standard, completely and utterly inflated. It was a bluff of gargantuan proportions. They were trying to project confidence by throwing money at a fire that was already consuming the building. I find this image to be one of the most delightful in the entire history of the century. A few men in expensive hats, standing in the middle of a crumbling empire, trying to convince the world that the wall hasn't actually fallen down. They were playing a role, of course. They were performing the part of the stable hand of the economy. And for 48 hours, it actually worked. The ticker tape slowed its frantic descent. The screaming in the hallways died down to a dull, anxious murmur. The bankers patted themselves on the back, accepted the congratulations of the press, and went home to their estates, convinced that they had successfully saved the world from the consequences of its own stupidity. Oh, the vanity! To believe that a giant pile of cash can temporarily obscure a structural collapse is the ultimate expression of the financier's creed. They thought they had fixed it. They thought they had merely adjusted the balance, smoothed out the wrinkles, and convinced the market to behave itself for a while longer. They didn't realize that they were not fighting a temporary downturn. They were fighting the inevitable, grinding and utterly indifferent physics of an economy that had spent too long living on the margin. They were trying to bribe the avalanche, and for a day or two, they actually thought the snow had stopped moving. It is a funny thing about bankers. They are the only people on earth who believe that they can negotiate with the tide. They have spent their lives managing the flow of money, and they have come to the conclusion that money is the only reality that matters. If there is a problem, throw money at it. If there is a disaster, throw money at it. If the entire world is going to hell in a handbasket, throw money at the basket and hope it gets a bit heavier. They are so insulated, so protected, and so profoundly invested in the importance of their own ledger books that they cannot conceive of a world where money is not the primary currency of influence. As the day drew to a close and the bankers retreated to their clubs to toast their own brilliance, the rest of the world was left to wonder what had happened. Was it over? Was the crash just a minor, unpleasant episode that had been successfully managed by the powers that be? The headlines the next day were optimistic, filled with words like confidence, correction, and solid foundation. They were trying to convince themselves, and they were trying to convince everyone else, that the dream was still alive, that the party was still going, and that the only thing that had happened was a bit of a spill in the punch bowl. I watched it all from a distance, with the cynical amusement of a man who has seen 1,000 such dramas played out on the stage of history. We are a species that is addicted to the punch bowl. We love the feeling of the sugar, the buzz of the alcohol, and the warmth of the temporary artificial glow. We are terrified of the morning. We are terrified of the sober truth. And we are terrified of the moment when we have to look in the mirror and realize that we are just a bunch of people who have spent far too much money on a party that was never meant to last. Black Thursday was the dress rehearsal. It was the moment when the curtain went up, the music hit a sour note, and the lead actor forgot his lines, but the audience, being too polite to leave, decided to stay in their seats and wait for the show to resume. They wanted to believe that the banker's intervention was the climax of the play, that the crisis had been averted, and that they could go back to their seats and continue their comfortable, profitable, and fundamentally imaginary lives. They didn't know that the lead actor wasn't just forgetting his lines. He was in the process of having a complete and total nervous breakdown. The ticker tape machines were, for the moment, silent. The streets of Manhattan were filled with the sound of shuffling feet and the nervous, muted chatter of 1,000 people who were trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed the end of the world. It was a strange, suspended animation. The system was holding by a thread, by a prayer, and by the sheer, stubborn, and ultimately futile hope of a few bankers who thought they could defy the laws of gravity with a ledger book. It was a day that changed everything, even if nobody wanted to admit it yet. It was the day the mask slipped. It was the day we realized that the stable hand of the economy was just a man with a checkbook, and that the solid foundation was just a series of promises that couldn't be kept. And so we went home, We slept a fitful, dream-filled sleep, and we woke up the next morning, hoping, praying, and insisting that everything was still the same. But the air was different. The atmosphere was brittle. The world had shifted, and the only thing left to do was to wait for the next, inevitable, and final push. It is a terrible, wonderful, and entirely necessary part of the human journey. The realization that the thing we have built is not the thing we thought it was. And for that, if for nothing else, I suppose we should be grateful. At least we know the truth, even if we are the last ones to admit it to ourselves. Chapter 17. Black Monday and Tuesday. The trapdoor opens. If you have ever had the misfortune of watching a man attempt to hold back the tide with a teaspoon, you have a fairly accurate representation of the New York Stock Exchange in the final days of October 1929. Following the frantic, desperate, and entirely performative intervention of the banking titans on Black Thursday, the public had been lulled into a state of precarious, trembling hope. They clung to the morning newspapers like a drowning man clings to a splintered oar, desperate to believe that the correction was behind them. But the market, a beast that possesses a profound and pitiless indifference to the feelings of its shareholders, had no intention of settling for a minor inconvenience. It was ready for the main event. On Monday, the dam didn't just leak, it surrendered. The illusion of stability, carefully propped up by the bankers and their over-leveraged pockets, collapsed with the gentle, sickening thud of a house of cards meeting a sudden gust of wind. It was not merely a drop in prices, it was a wholesale, panicked liquidation of the American dream. The ticker-tape machines, those mechanical gossips that had spent the year whispering secrets of prosperity, suddenly began to scream in their own unintelligible language. They fell hours behind, churning out streams of paper that were already ancient history by the time they hit the floor. An investor in the Midwest was watching his fortune vanish based on prices that had been valid 2 hours ago, while in Manhattan, the prices were already 1,000 miles into the abyss. It is a peculiar kind of horror to see your life's work disintegrate in a haze of ink on a ribbon of paper that you can no longer read. The chaos of Monday was but a prelude to the true unadulterated catastrophe of Tuesday. If Monday was the opening act, Tuesday was the final, screaming collapse of the entire stage. 16 million shares changed hands in a single, frenzied day of trading. A volume of transactions so absurd, so gargantuan, and so utterly unprecedented that the very infrastructure of the exchange threatened to simply melt under the strain. There was no buying. There was no long-term perspective. There was only the singular, desperate, and primal urge to get out, to run, to sell, to wash one's hands of the entire rotting enterprise before the floor vanished completely. I find myself marveling at the sheer kinetic energy of a total economic collapse. It is a spectacle of such scale that one cannot help but admire the thoroughness of the destruction. It was not a tidy affair. It was a messy, loud, and incredibly public dismantling of the structures we had spent a decade building. You had men in suits, men who had spent their entire lives cultivating the appearance of calm, rational, and supremely confident leaders, now reduced to shouting, weeping, and clawing at the bars of the trading floor. They were no longer the masters of the game. They were the cattle in a stampede, and they were, for all their wealth and all their influence, entirely helpless. The trapdoor had opened, and we were all falling, the bankers, those stalwarts of the Black Thursday charade, finally ran out of cash. Their piles of gold, their lines of credit, and their practiced expressions of authority were not enough to stem the tide. They stood on the sidelines helpless, as the value of the American economy was liquidated in a fire sale that had no bottom. The paper millionaires, those men who had spent the summer counting their imaginary fortunes on the back of their cocktail napkins, suddenly found that their wealth had not been stolen by a rival. It had simply ceased to exist. It had turned from a concrete, undeniable reality into an imaginary number in an afternoon, a phantom that had been summoned by the market and was now being dismissed back into the void. It is a funny thing about wealth. We treat it as if it were a permanent, substantial feature of the landscape, like a mountain or a river. We forget that it is, at its heart, a collective agreement. It is a belief. And when that belief is shattered, when the people stop believing in the value of the shares, the mountain dissolves, the river dries up, and you are left standing in the middle of a barren, silent plain, wondering how you ever managed to convince yourself that the view was real. The Tuesday crash wasn't just a loss of money, it was a loss of faith. It was the moment we all realized that the new era we had been cheering for was, in fact, a very old and very familiar kind of folly. The scenes on the floor of the exchange were, by all accounts, a scene out of a fever dream. The roar of the trading floor had turned into a cacophony of madness. Orders were ignored, phone lines were dead, and the men who were supposed to be orchestrating the dance were now merely spectators to their own ruin. It was the democratic process of destruction. It didn't matter if you were a titan of industry or a clerk with a modest savings account. The market was busy liquidating you both with the same cold, impartial efficiency. The greed that had brought us together, the greed that had fueled the roar of the 20s, was now the very force that was driving us apart as everyone scrambled to save their own skin, leaving the rest of the world to suffer the consequences. I remember reading the accounts of the days that followed, the descriptions of the men who walked out of the exchange with their hats pulled low, the men who looked as though they had just seen a ghost. And in a way they had. They had seen the ghost of their own success. They had realized that the entire project, the skyscrapers, the radios, the cars, the loans, the margin, was a grand, elaborate, and fundamentally fragile construct. They had built their house on the ticker tape, and when the ticker tape tore, the house came down around their ears. And yet there was a strange, grim beauty to it. It was the sound of the world resetting itself. It was the sound of the excess being scrubbed away, the pretense being stripped off, and the reality of our condition finally making itself known. We were a nation that had been living too high, too fast, and too loudly, and the crash was the sudden, sharp, and entirely necessary return to the earth. It was a cold, hard, and unforgiving return, to be sure, but it was real. For the first time in 10 years, we weren't looking at the ticker tape. We were looking at the world as it actually was. The trapdoor had opened, and we had fallen through. We were bruised, we were battered, and we were collectively quite broke. But we were finally standing on the ground. We were no longer living in the clouds, no longer betting our futures on the imaginary numbers of the market, and no longer playing the part of the sophisticated modern investor. We were just people, standing in the ruins, wondering how we were going to get through the winter. It is a humbling, grounding, and potentially clarifying position. As the sun set on that Tuesday, a Tuesday that would be etched into the memory of the nation for generations, the world felt smaller, quieter, and fundamentally different. The party was not just over, the room was being cleared, the lights were being dimmed, and the reality of the coming decade was beginning to settle in. We had had our fun, we had danced on the glass floor, we had reached for the stars with our margins, and we had spent every penny of the future before it had even arrived. And now we were going to have to pay the tab. It is the human condition, I suppose. We love the climb, we love the view from the peak, and we love the feeling of being masters of the universe, all while we are blissfully unaware of the fact that we are merely standing on the lip of a trapdoor. But the fall is the part that teaches us who we are. The fall is the part that strips away the vanity, the pride, and the pretense, and leaves us with nothing but the truth. And in 1929, the truth was as cold, as hard, and as final as a winter morning in Chicago. We had finally stopped dancing, and for the first time in a decade, we were listening to the sound of our own footsteps on the earth. It wasn't a particularly happy sound, and it certainly wasn't the sound of the ticker tape, but at least it was honest. And that, in a world that had spent so long living in a dream, was perhaps the only thing that really mattered. Chapter 18. The Multi-Billion-Dollar Disappearing Act. There is a charmingly naive belief, held by most people who have never had the pleasure of going thoroughly, comprehensively bankrupt, that money is a physical substance, a tangible thing that hides in vaults, sits in bank accounts, and possesses a permanent objective existence. They imagine that when a fortune is lost, it is merely moved from one pocket to another, as if the wealth of the nation were a finite pile of gold coins being shuffled around by a very clumsy and mischievous croupier. But the events of late 1929 taught us a much more sobering and infinitely more whimsical lesson. Wealth, in the modern age, is not a substance, it is a mood. And when the mood changes, the wealth doesn't just migrate, it simply ceases to exist. It evaporates into the ether, vanishing like the steam from a kettle that has been taken off the fire. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, a sort of collective panicked arithmetic seized the country. Everyone was trying to calculate where the money had gone. They looked at their brokers, they looked at their banks, they looked at the government, and they looked at the sky, as if expecting the lost billions to fall back down like a shower of manna. But the money hadn't gone into a rival's pocket. It hadn't been packed into crates and shipped to the Orient. It had simply been an imaginary number that everyone had agreed to treat as a reality. And the moment the agreement was broken, the reality became a ghost. The era of the paper millionaire ended with a quiet, persistent rustle of abandoned ledger pages, and the era of the actual eviction began with the ominous, rhythmic thud of a landlord's fist on the front door. I find this to be the most delightful irony of the whole sad business. We had spent years convincing ourselves that we were the architects of a new, enlightened, and perpetual prosperity. We had looked at our stock certificates and seen the keys to a kingdom of eternal leisure. And yet, the moment the music stopped, we discovered that our kingdom was built on the same stuff as a child's daydream. We had turned from concrete, breathing, eating human beings into arithmetic problems, and when the math failed, we were left with nothing but the equations. It is a lesson in the dangers of abstraction, I suppose. If you spend too much time living in the world of numbers, you eventually forget that the world is made of dirt, wood, and the very real necessity of eating 3 meals a day. The aftermath was a scene of unparalleled and occasionally hilarious desperation. You had men who, only a week prior, had been discussing the nuances of international trade and the merits of heavy rail, now reduced to counting the pennies in their change purses and wondering if the local pawnbroker would accept a set of silk cravats in exchange for a loaf of bread and a bit of cheese. The social hierarchy of the nation, which had been so carefully constructed over the previous decade, was suddenly and violently flattened. It didn't matter if you had been a titan of industry or a clerk in a dry goods store. If you had been playing the margin, you were now a member of the same struggling fraternity of the dispossessed. We had achieved, quite by accident, the most perfect egalitarian misery that the world had ever seen. The government, of course, responded with the kind of frantic, useless activity that defines the bureaucrat's approach to the apocalypse. They issued statements. They formed committees. They held meetings where men in suits stood around and talked about restoring market confidence, as if confidence were a lost umbrella that could be found in the office of Lost and Found. They didn't seem to understand that you cannot restore confidence by talking about it. You can only restore confidence by rebuilding the world, one brick at a time. And that is a project that requires a great deal more than just rhetoric and a nice pair of polished shoes. But consider the behavior of the public, which is always, in my estimation, the most interesting part of any disaster. Did they storm the citadels of power? Did they demand a reckoning? Did they, for the most part, turn into the revolutionary fire-breathing mob that the newspaper editors had warned us about? No. They did what the American people have always done when faced with the inexplicable. They turned their collars up against the wind, they tightened their belts until they could barely breathe, and they went right back to the business of trying to survive. There is a certain quiet dignity in that, even if it is a dignity born of absolute, crushing resignation. They had been lied to, they had been swindled, and they had been seduced by a dream that had turned into a nightmare, and yet they remained, for the most part, a remarkably polite and orderly collection of victims. One imagines the conversations that took place around the kitchen tables in the suburbs of the country. "Well, Martha," the husband would say, staring into his cold cup of coffee, "the stock is gone, the bank is closed, and we're going to have to sell the Buick, but at least we still have the house." And Martha, with the patience of a saint and the eyes of a woman who has seen the future and decided it wasn't worth the fuss, would simply nod and go back to darning the socks. It is the story of the nation. We are a people who are fundamentally, stubbornly attached to the idea that as long as we have a roof over our heads and a bit of thread for our stockings, we can endure just about anything. The paper millionaires were now actual evictees, and the shift was as jarring as it was inevitable. The transition from a life of speculative leisure to a life of hard-bitten, day-to-day survival was not just a financial change, it was a character-building exercise of the highest and most brutal order. We were being forged in the fires of our own greed, and the heat was, to put it mildly, quite intense. The optimism that had characterized the year 1929, the optimism of the airships, the radio, the lithiated lemonade, and the dancing skeletons, was being rapidly replaced by a new, colder, and more realistic philosophy. The philosophy of the breadline. It is all a bit of a laugh when you take the time to view it from the perspective of the coming years. We were so very, very clever, weren't we? We had the ticker tape, we had the margin, we had the brokers, and we had the bankers, and we were all so proud of our complex, intertwined, and fundamentally unsustainable reality. We had built a skyscraper out of smoke and convinced ourselves it was made of steel, and when the breeze blew a little too hard, we stood around, mouth agape, watching it drift away into the sky. And the most amusing part is that even as it drifted away, we were still reaching for it, trying to catch the wisps of the smoke, still trying to trade the shadows of our wealth as if they were solid gold. The money didn't go anywhere. That is the secret, the punchline to the longest joke in history. The money was never there to begin with. It was a consensus, a wink, a nod, and a mutual agreement to pretend that a piece of paper was worth 1,000 hours of labor. And when the music stopped, and we all looked at our pieces of paper and wondered why they didn't feel like 1,000 hours of labor anymore, we were finally forced to confront the fact that we were living in a world of our own making. We had created the bubble. We had blown it up until it was shimmering and bright and filled with our own reflections, and when it popped, we had no one to blame but the reflection. I suppose that is the most important lesson of all, that if you want to build a life, you had better make sure it is built on something a bit more substantial than a ticker tape. You had better make sure that the floor you are standing on is made of something stronger than the confidence of a stranger. You had better make sure that when the lights go out, you are not left standing in the middle of a room that was only ever there because you decided it was. But that is the work of a lifetime, and in 1929 we were all far too busy playing the game to consider the reality of the board. So, the disappearances has continued, the fortunes evaporated, and the nation settled into the quiet, somber rhythm of the winter. The saxophones were being pawned, the champagne was flat, and the only thing that was booming was the sound of the silence. It was a beautiful, tragic, and entirely inevitable way to end the decade. We had lived like kings, and we were now going to have to learn how to live like human beings. And if the transition was a bit bumpy, well, that's just the price you pay for spending 10 years dancing on a glass floor while convincing yourself it was solid diamond. I, for one, am looking forward to the next show. I just hope that next time we bring our own chairs and perhaps, just perhaps, we leave the ticker tape at home. It's far too noisy, and it never ever tells the truth. Chapter 19. The Museum of Modern Art opens. It is a singular quirk of the human animal that we are never so inclined to appreciate the abstract, the chaotic, and the profoundly unsettling, as when our own bank accounts have been rendered entirely and quite spectacularly abstract. In November 1929, just 9 days after the market finally decided to stop pretending that it possessed a floor and instead opted to investigate the depths of the cellar, the Museum of Modern Art opened its doors in a Manhattan office building. While the old money was busy packing its bags, staring at the sidewalk from the upper floor windows of their penthouses, and wondering how one might trade a yacht for a steady supply of potatoes, the new art finally found a permanent home. It was a bit of timing so exquisite that it deserves a standing ovation from the gods of irony themselves. There is a distinct, sharp-edged satisfaction in walking through a gallery of geometric anxiety, while the rest of the world is busy undergoing an existential nervous breakdown. The art was full of shapes that didn't know what they wanted to be, colors that refused to apologize for their audacity, and perspectives that insisted on looking at the world from three directions at once. It was the perfect visual accompaniment to the news of the day. If the economy was refusing to behave in a logical, linear fashion, why should the canvas? If the bankers were suddenly unable to explain the state of the treasury, why should the painter be expected to explain the state of the portrait? I found myself wondering, as I strolled through those quiet, pristine rooms, whether the art had driven the crash or whether the crash had finally cleared the way for the art. There is a deep subterranean connection between the fever of speculation and the fever of expressionism. Both require a certain detachment from reality, a willingness to ignore the evidence of one's own eyes in favor of a more, shall we say, visionary interpretation of the facts. The speculators had been painting their own masterpieces of wealth on the canvas of the ticker tape, and the artists had been painting their masterpieces of madness on the canvas of the easel. Both had succeeded in convincing a small, dedicated audience that their work was the most important thing in the universe, right up until the moment it wasn't. The opening was a modest affair, held in a suite of rooms that lacked the cavernous, echoing grandeur of the traditional temples of high culture. It was a domestic, intimate setting, a place where one could look at a painting without feeling like a peasant approaching a cathedral. The patrons were an earnest, slightly nervous bunch, clutching their programs and trying to decide whether they were supposed to be impressed by the lack of discernible objects in the paintings, or whether they were supposed to be worried that their glasses were suddenly malfunctioning. It is a terrifying thing to stand before a painting of a triangle that is claiming to be an emotion and to realize that you haven't the slightest idea what the artist is talking about. But then, in 1929, nobody really knew what anyone else was talking about, so it fit the occasion quite nicely. One cannot help but note the contrast between the old world and the new. The old world was represented by the gilded frames, the realistic landscapes, and the portraits of wealthy men with beards that took up more space on the canvas than their personalities. It was an art of certainty. It was an art that insisted that the world was exactly what it appeared to be, and that if you were rich enough, you could buy a little piece of that world to hang in your library. The new art, the art of the MoMA, was an art of uncertainty. It was an art that insisted the world was fragmented, shifting, and deeply, deeply strange. It was an art for an age of margin calls, and it was perfectly suited to a population that had just discovered that its own foundations were made of shifting sand. I overheard a gentleman remark, as he squinted at a canvas full of nervous, jagged lines, that he didn't know what it meant, but he found it terribly evocative. It is a beautiful phrase, isn't it? Terribly evocative. It is the perfect linguistic camouflage for I haven't the foggiest notion what I am looking at, but I don't want to be the first to admit it. We were all practicing our terribly evocative faces in the wake of the crash. We were all looking at our empty pockets, our shuttered businesses, and our mounting debts, and we were all trying to act as though we were participating in some grand, artistic, and entirely evocative historical transition, rather than just admitting we had been taken for a ride. The museum was a sanctuary. It was a place where one could go to escape the tedious, repetitive, and increasingly grim reality of the streets. If you couldn't afford a meal, you could at least stare at a canvas full of geometric anxiety and convince yourself that your own suffering was just a part of the greater, universal, and, quite frankly, evocative human condition. It provided a frame for the chaos. It turned the messy, bloody, and entirely incoherent experience of the market crash into a curated, well-lit, and perfectly professional exhibition. And isn't that what we all want in the end? We don't want to be victims of a catastrophe. We want to be observers of an event. We want to be able to step back, adjust our tie, and say, yes, that's an interesting composition, isn't it? Even as the world around us is being rearranged by forces we haven't the capacity to influence. One must credit the founders of the institution with a sort of divine, unintentional comedy. To open a temple to modern art on the very heels of the most spectacular failure of the modern economic experiment is a masterstroke of historical juxtaposition. It was as if they were saying, the money is gone, the banks are shuttered, and the old order is in tatters. So, let's go look at some squares and circles and see if we can't find a bit of comfort in the abstraction. It is a very, very American thing to do. We don't mourn our failures, we curate them. We don't dwell on our losses, we turn them into an exhibit and charge admission. I wandered the rooms for a time, letting the colors wash over me, trying to see if there was any message hidden in the geometry. I looked for a hint of the ticker tape in the jagged lines, a suggestion of the bread lines in the muted tones, and a reflection of the national mood in the deliberate, aggressive lack of representational clarity. I suppose it was all there, if one looked hard enough. Or perhaps it was just a collection of paint and canvas, and the tragedy was entirely in my own head. That is the beauty of the thing. The painting doesn't care. It doesn't care about the market. It doesn't care about the museum. And it certainly doesn't care whether you have the price of admission in your pocket. It just sits there, an inanimate, silent, and entirely stubborn object, and lets you do all the work. There is a lesson here, perhaps, about the durability of the human spirit. We are a species that will continue to create, to curate, and to observe, even when everything we have built is being dismantled. We are a species that will find meaning in a line, hope in a shade, and beauty in a breakdown. And that, in an age where the only thing being produced in any quantity was disappointment, is a small, quiet, and profoundly important achievement. The museum opened, the lights stayed on, and the art remained. And for those of us who had spent the last 9 days wondering if the floor was ever going to stop falling, that was enough. It was an exhibit of the new, in a year that had suddenly and violently ended the old. And as I stepped out of the building and into the cold, gray air of a Manhattan winter, I felt a strange, lingering sense of peace. The world was still broken, the bank accounts were still empty, and the ticker was still cold. But we had the squares, and we had the circles, and for the moment, that seemed like a perfectly reasonable trade. Chapter 20, 1930, is lining up for soup. We have arrived at last at the final station of our grand, catastrophic, and altogether dizzying tour of 1929. The train has pulled into the platform with a screech of rusted metal that sounds remarkably like the collective groan of 1,000,000 defaulted mortgages. And the conductor, a man who looks suspiciously like a tax auditor with a sense of humor, is informing us that there are no return tickets. We are standing on the threshold of a new decade, and the view, I am sorry to report, is not nearly as panoramic as the brochures had promised. The saxophones are being pawned. The champagne has gone flatter than a day-old pancake, and the entire world is standing on the doorstep of a future that promises to be defined by breadlines, dust clouds, and very long waits for very little reward. It is a curious thing, the way the world cleans up after a disaster. When the party ends, when the last glass has been shattered, the last guest has been escorted out, and the host is left standing in the middle of a room that smells of stale smoke and regret. There is always a moment of profound, jarring silence. That is where we find ourselves now. The roaring part of the 20s has been muffled, quite effectively, by the heavy, leaden blanket of reality. The jazz has been replaced by the rhythmic clatter of empty spoons against tin bowls, and the frantic, high-speed energy of the stock ticker has been supplanted by the slow, grinding, and utterly relentless pace of the queue. One cannot help but admire the sheer, brutal efficiency with which history works. One moment we were the masters of the universe, convinced that we had outsmarted the nature of scarcity itself, and the next moment we were standing in the cold, waiting for a ladle of soup, and wondering if the morning would ever bring anything more substantial than a promise. It is the great universal equalizer, this sudden plunge into the depths. It doesn't care if you were a financier, a poet, or a man who spent his life polishing the silverware in the mansions of the elite. When the hunger arrives, it arrives for everyone, and it brings with it a certain sobering perspective that no amount of margin trading can provide. I find the humor in this to be particularly sharp, like a razor blade hidden in a slice of dry bread. We spent the last few years convincing ourselves that we were too modern, too clever, and too important to be bound by the laws of common sense. We built our little houses of cards, we filled them with the furniture of our own ego, and we invited the world to come and admire the architecture. And now, as we watch the structure disintegrate, we are left to stand in the rain, clutching our hats and wondering where the umbrella went. It is the sort of comedy that would be funny if the weather weren't so terribly, painfully cold. Consider the cast of characters we have gathered for this final solemn act. You have the men who were once the titans of the exchange, now wandering the streets in coats that are starting to show a bit of wear at the elbows, looking for a way to maintain the illusion of their own importance, while the world around them is busy forgetting their names. You have the shopkeepers who have shuttered their windows, the farmers who are looking at their fields with a mixture of bewilderment and despair, and the millions of ordinary souls who are just trying to get through the day and are now discovering that the day is a much longer and much more difficult proposition than they had ever imagined. They are all standing in line. They are all in their own way waiting for a turn that may never come. But look at them. Look at the way they hold their heads, even in the soup line. There is a stubborn, defiant, and entirely irrational spark of pride that refuses to be extinguished, even when the pockets are empty and the cupboards are bare. We are a species of actors, and we will keep playing our parts, even when the theater is burning down. We will straighten our ties, we will pull our hats down over our eyes, and we will insist on maintaining a veneer of dignity, even as we are being asked to trade our pride for a bowl of thin, tasteless liquid. It is the most human, the most absurd, and the most magnificent part of the whole tragedy. We refuse to be defeated, even when the victory has long since been claimed by the forces of the market. As I look out over the landscape of 1930, I don't see the end of the world. I see the end of a long, loud, and incredibly expensive nap. We were dreaming, you see. We were dreaming that we had mastered the world, that we had conquered the future, and that we could, by the sheer force of our own desire, hold the clock at a permanent standstill. And the crash, the grand multi-billion-dollar disappearing act, was just the moment when the alarm clock finally went off. We are waking up. We are rubbing our eyes. We are feeling the cold, and we are finally realizing that the world is a much bigger, much harder, and much more demanding place than our dreams had allowed us to believe. Is it a tragedy? Certainly. Is it a catastrophe? Without a doubt. But is it an end? I should think not. We are a resilient bunch when we are pushed to it. We have been burned before, and we will be burned again. And we have a remarkable, if occasionally frustrating, habit of getting back up, dusting off our knees, and setting out to build a new house of cards, even if we know that the wind is already gathering its strength. It's what we do. We are the architects of the temporary, the master builders of the illusion, and the eternal, indestructible dreamers of the impossible. So, here we are, standing in the doorway of a decade that promises to be defined by breadlines, dust clouds, and very long waits for very little reward. The champagne is flat, the party is over, and the guests are finally leaving, clutching their coats and trying to remember where they parked the car. It is a long, cold walk home, and I imagine that the conversation along the way will be sparse and punctuated by the sound of shivering. But as I look at the line forming for the soup kitchen, I see something that the ticker tape could never show me. I see people, real people, with real lives, real memories, and a real burning, stubborn refusal to let the darkness be the final word. The saxophones have been pawned, yes. The champagne has been traded for a bit of warmth, and the dream of the new era has been packed away in a trunk labeled regrets. But the music? The music is still there somewhere, hiding in the back of the throat or the rhythm of the step. And as long as we can find a way to hum along, even if we are standing in the soup line, we haven't lost everything. We have lost the ticker, we have lost the margin, and we have lost the hubris of the heights. But we have kept our rhythm. And as anyone who has ever survived a crash can tell you, the rhythm is the only thing that actually matters when the floor starts to fall. So, let 1930 arrive. Let it bring its breadlines and its dust, its long nights and its slow, grinding days. We are ready, or at least we are as ready as we ever are for the inevitable. We have been through the fire, we have seen the trap door, and we have lived to tell the tale. And if the tale is a bit short on profit and long on misery, well, that's the nature of the story, isn't it? It's not the gold that makes the history. It's the people who are left standing when the gold is gone. And looking at the line stretching out into the dark and the cold, I have a feeling that we're going to be just fine. We're going to wait. We're going to eat our soup. And then, when the sun finally decides to show its face, we're going to start building all over again. After all, that's what we do. We build, we break, we stand, we wait, and then we dance. Even if it's just in the line for the soup, the rhythm is always there, and the show, despite the best efforts of the market, always goes on.